Redevelopment Agency board meeting. We're happy to have you with us, and we're going to get started. We're missing a couple of board members, but we have a quorum, so we will start. We'll be joined, I'm sure, by the other board members shortly, and we will begin our meeting today with a public hearing on the budget amendment number 3 for fiscal year 2017, and have a comment card from George Chapman. George, you want to come forward, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Okay, George Chapman, Madam Chair. Be really nice if you figured out a way to summarize 1,800 pages of today's RDA meeting and let the public see what exactly is going on, because this is really important information. But nobody's going to read 1,800 pages. In fact, I'll be surprised if there are more than me speaking on it. You're still pushing a lot of money into the Depot District, and I don't think it makes sense because you have not figured out what you're going to do with the Depot District. The Wiggins Center and the St. Vincent de Paul Center are not going away. The Forestry Clinic is not going away, and the Rescue Mission is not going away. So if you're spending millions of dollars down there and wishing a hope and a dream, it's not going to happen. I urge you to slow down. There is one recommendation that the sheriff made a couple of weeks ago that makes sense, and that is maybe using the RDA money to remove the park on 500 West, because that park is being used for fun and games and drugs by the homeless that are addicted to drugs. And that's a big issue. So if you remove the park and put in parking, it kind of stops that. And that's a decent suggestion, I think. I'm also concerned about special assessment areas because some of the projects that you're looking at have high maintenance. And you're going to get into the same problem that the county got into when they bought parks, but the parks don't have any funding for maintenance. So you're about to do the same thing again in the RDA area. You're not going to have enough funding for maintenance. And I urge you to slow down for that reason too. You're talking about taking out the 400 West tracks, but really you have a downtown streetcar wish or dream in a few years to put something north-south on around 400 West. So why are you taking out tracks now when you should wait until you figure out whether or not you're going to actually have a streetcar on that 400 West corridor? And the Convention Center Hotel, I do agree with the recommendation. You don't need a convention center right now. Again, I would like to see more than just me commenting on this, but if you don't summarize it into 1 or 2 pages and put it out, nobody's going to comment on it, and that's a sad commentary on our government. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. I think you're going to like how this meeting goes, because we're going to go over every single part of it. So many of you may have heard that today's agenda has been changed slightly. We've cleared it to focus on financial tools and the administration's recommended budget amendment, because what we received was 950 pages, and that is a lot, and it's $50 million that we're spending, so we want to spend time and go through item by item and take the time to do that. And in many ways, this budget amendment is actually a much larger budget discussion because it is setting the stage for the FY 2018 annual budget, and it sets a precedent for how funding projects are considered in the future. And we are in a new universe. We're doing things differently than we have in the past, and we hope we're improving as we're doing that. That's our goal. So first today, we're going to hear from the Finance Department and the city's financial advisor, who will go over financial tools available to the RDA. And then we will hear from the Attorney's Office, because we're still addressing projects initiated under the old organizational model, so we need to talk a little bit about that. And funding decisions are being made under the new separation of powers model. So we'll have Katie Lewis from the City Attorney's Office give us a broad overview of what legal and implied commitments we have. And the RDA might be dealing with current issues, and we will transition into, as we go into the transition of powers model. Then we'll hear from council staff going over the budget, and then we will I'm going to invite the board members to, as we go through the budget, I want to adopt something today if we can, but I'd like you to be looking at things that you think are appropriate to adopt today. We may not adopt the whole budget, we might, but we might not. But if there are parts that you think would be appropriate, then if you can flag those and we can have a draft for adoption put together by staff, then we can do that. I realized because we changed the agenda that I did not do the general comment period. We had the specific ones on the budget, and I only have one card, but I see we've got another card in the audience, so come on up. Okay, anyone who's speaking, if I can have someone collect the cards and bring them to me, then I'll read your name, and you get 2 minutes, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. These are general comments to the board. Thank you so much. And we will hear first from Chris Sarek, followed by James, help me with Alfonde, right? Am I getting it right? Okay. And then Jesse. Thanks, Hulse.
Hello, thank you. My name is Chris Zarek. I own a small development company in town here that has land and projects in the Central 9th neighborhood. So I'm here speaking in favor of the street improvements on 900 South, centered around the intersection at 200 West. I think, I guess generally, it's a well-known trope that one should dress for the job that they want. The RDA has said in the West Temple neighborhood that they want a project area that encourages TOD, supports the Central 9th neighborhood, and provides an attractive urban environment. And I think that the improvements that you'll see on 900 South are a really critical part of that. What exists there right now is a road, and a road is a way for cars to get from place to place. A street is for people, and a street is for supports bikes, supports pedestrians, supports conversations, and supports places. And that's really what we're trying to create in this neighborhood is an anchor, in the same way that the street improvements at 9th and 9th have created a kind of anchor in that particular neighborhood. And that's something that's really clear to me because that's a place where I live, and I chose to live there specifically because of that anchor. What research shows is that multimodal places and these kinds of street improvements create stronger communities, healthier people, and increased property value. And in that way, it really becomes an investment. In speaking to the businesses that are on 900 South, which are a critical part of making a transit-oriented neighborhood, this council did a couple of interesting things with the zoning in this neighborhood. It created a high-density zone to encourage density, and a low-density zone to help preserve the really interesting single-family housing that we had there. The issue that you have with that, and both of those are laudable, but what we find is the businesses there are going to need more than just the people in this neighborhood to create a customer base. They're going to need people like me to drive over from 9th and 9th.
Your last
Sure.
thought, thanks.
Very good. So I appreciate your consideration. This has been a success story, this neighborhood, and I ask you to put the exclamation point on it. Thank you.
Thank you. James, and then Jesse.
My name is James Alfondre, here also to comment on the street improvements on 900 South, around 200 West. For a lot of reasons. I know that you all know what good urbanism is, and that street improvements, these street improvements will go a long way in helping push this neighborhood over the top to become one of the best urban neighborhoods in Salt Lake City. And we're so close, and these street improvements will really help us get there. I've been working in the neighborhood for the last 7 years, focusing on people-centered places, and we know that our streets are inefficient and that they can be used much more efficiently. But not only that, power lines. Every great urban neighborhood, the one thing they have in common, among others, is there are no above-surface power lines. That really inhibits growth. As you know, the new housing plan came out, and we talk about more density around transit stops, that these power lines really have to be undergrounded. I would urge the council to look at all the work that's been done through the neighborhood visioning process, the workshops that have been done, the master plans that have been done that all incorporate these kinds of improvements. And again, we worked so hard to get this far. The zoning is in place. They're great people doing great things down there, and these street improvements, including undergrounding utilities, is really what this neighborhood needs to get over the top. So I urge you all to please vote in favor of the improvements on 9th South. Thanks.
Thank you. Jesse Hills.
I'm also wanting to speak about funding the 9th South Street improvements. My colleagues did a fantastic job of painting a picture, so I won't reiterate all of it, but it is something that we've been working on for a long time in the neighborhood with a lot of input from residents and businesses, and the staff's done a fantastic job. We're all really counting on it. We need the increased parking on the streets for our businesses to flourish. We need the shade trees for neighborhood comfort. We need pedestrian safety. Right now, it is a very, very busy thoroughfare, and we need that traffic slowed down. And the undergrounding of utilities is crucial to make that happen. The plan really does not work without undergrounding those utilities. There isn't physically enough space to make it happen unless we get those poles down. So we understand it's an investment, but we know it will really pay off in the long run, and we would just want to keep building on the success we've seen down there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who has a general comment? All right, then, Anne, I'm looking for direction. Do I need to close public hearing? Okay. An hour later. Okay. Is there a better time than now? All right, then I'd look for a motion to close the public hearing.
So moved.
Moved by Board Member Johnston, seconded by Board Member Mendenhall. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the public hearing is closed. Next item of business, approval of the minutes from the February 14th, 2017 RDA meeting.
I move approval.
Okay. Moved by Board Member Mendenhall, seconded by Board Member Penfold. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes are approved. Thank you. And at this juncture, we will ask the Finance Department and the Financial Advisor to come forward and help us understand some of the tools that are available to us to fund some of the great things that we were just talking about.
Good afternoon. Oh, can I move this a little?
And you've been here before, but you have to really speak into those.
Get
Thanks.
really close. Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Reed. I'm from George K. Baum and Company. And to my left is Blake Wade.
Gilmore and Bell. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. I just wanted to mention that John Crandall regrets that he is unable to be here. He had a previous family outing planned.
I get it.
Yes, it's spring break. So as financial advisor, we were asked to determine financing options for a list of RDA projects. From January to February, we produced 3 memos describing different financing options based on information we received from the RDA and city staff. The outcome from those memos were the following. The first memo, the RDA could issue, our conclusion was that the RDA could issue general revenue bonds in the amount of $9 million. The second memo we produced, the city could issue sales tax revenue bonds to fund $17.2 million in projects. And the third memo, we concluded that the city could issue sales tax revenue bonds to support $20 million in projects. I would now like to go into a little more detail, but still summarize our conclusions based on the memos that I believe you received in your packets. So the RDA can issue tax increment revenue bonds or general revenue bonds. And when we produced our first memo on January 19th, 2017, we were provided a list of projects in the amount of $36.5 million. And the projected revenues for each one of the project areas associated with the project list. We determined that the project area revenues as provided are not enough to support the capital improvements identified. After conversations with Katie Lewis and Blake, it was determined that the tax increment is not portable from one project area to another. So CBD tax increment can't pay for a project in another area, for example. So as financial advisor, our suggestion was maybe they could utilize a general revenue pledge and possibly use the RDA's program income fund. And using the program income fund, which is, we estimated that they could issue a bond financing under that general revenue pledge in the amount of approximately $9 million. The second memo we produced was on January 20th, so just the following day. And the list was prioritized, and for hypothetical purposes, we chose an amount of $20 million. And this time having the city issue sales tax revenue bonds rather than the RDA issuing bonds. It would be the city issuing sales tax revenue bonds. And we estimated that a $20 million project amount would have annual debt service of $1.4 million annually. So, but even if the city issues the sales tax revenue bonds, those they could enter into an agreement with the RDA, and the RDA could pay those bonds back using tax increment revenues as well as program income fund revenues. And you can jump in at any time.
You're doing just
Okay.
fine.
So we concluded, based on the tax increment revenue and the program income fund, that the city could issue approximately $7.2 million. Because of the sunset on some of the tax increment revenues, the program income fund, I think the last sunset is 2024, so the program income funds would be supporting the annual debt service payment after 2024, and based on those revenues, the program income fund falls short about $300,000 per year. So we established that the city could issue sales tax revenue bonds to support $17.2 million in projects. And then the third memo we produced in February added the addition of, the fund balances as of fiscal year 2017 for from the project areas. So the use of the $3.5 million available in certain project areas and the availability of the program income fund and tax increment revenues, we concluded that all those funds would be available to support a $20 million project.
Okay, any questions?
I just want to clarify on that February memo, those are all RDA sourced funds.
That's correct.
And it's only your January 20th memo that is the city issuing the bond.
No, the third memo is also the city would issue tax. So the second memo is sales tax revenue bonds issued by the city. The third memo is also bonds issued by the city, sales tax revenue bonds, but paid by
PIF, TIF, and the fund balance at 3.5,
Correct.
which is back on Budget Amendment 2.
So you're using the sales tax credit for the market, but the RDA is actually repaying the
Great,
bonds.
thanks.
So both the first two memos were based on Budget Amendment number 2. The third memo was based on the base, removing Budget Amendment number 2, but putting your Budget Amendment number 2 in. So it was the base where we started, including the information that you gave us and you passed and adopted. Does not include Budget Amendment number 3
Right, that's
inside
what I
the
meant.
last one.
Thanks.
Madam Chair.
Further questions? Yeah.
Could you speak, or can you have staff speak to the tax income revenue sources that you used as a indicator of capacity? And what I'm getting at is, it looks to me like those were a little conservative. And I wanted to just see how you went off actuals as of today, or if you went off revenue minus commitments, or what we used to generate that revenue number.
The tax increment revenue stream, we were provided tax increment revenue projections and the availability of the funds.
So, Madam Chair, I have a question as to whether those were full tax revenue projections or tax revenue projections minus some sort of predetermined commitment, and we might need to follow up on that just to find out what that was. The other thing I'm hearing is that we most likely would get a better rate with a sales tax guaranteed. And I mean, that's part of the strategy, is that the rate's probably better, it's more reliable, but then we could actually go and form a relationship with the RDA to reimburse once those bonds were committed.
That's correct.
And I guess board members, one of the things I want to consider as we talk about our budget conversations today is we've, over the years over the past 4 years, have had some conversations around a change in direction about our strategy with RDA tax increment from a traditional strategy of drawing an RDA area and then sort of sitting back with a plan and waiting for tax increment to happen to us. And that we find ourselves in situations like we are now with the granary or with Central 9, for example, where those tax districts are expiring, and we have not raised enough tax revenue to pay for the projects we wanted that we said were critical, like undergrounding power lines. And so one of the philosophies we've talked about a little bit in a shift is going into new districts with a very specific project of some sort initiated by the RDA, potentially in partnership with the city, that could kick off our tax revenue stream earlier and larger than we have traditionally. And so I think it'll come up later in our conversation, and I just wanted to make sure I'm not saying anything out of line, so stop me if I am. But if we, for example, had a conversation up front in a new project area saying that we might want to bond to underground power lines, if that's the number one thing we think will encourage investment in that area, that might be worth doing an early investment, and we may see some accelerated revenue rather than the model we see now, which is pretty much we wait until we have revenue before we do any investment, and that can be 5-10 years. In some areas, if you look at 400 West, it could be never. That district will expire before we have enough money to do a project that we said was critical to the success of that project area. So I just want to put that context around how we're talking about these revenue numbers. For you, did you explore any other bonding opportunities other than sales tax revenue bonds? Did you look at anything else through partnership with the city, tax obligation bonds, or anything else? Did you look at any other mechanism, or did you confine it to sales tax?
Yeah, we just the sales tax.
And so that is our full capacity in our sales tax.
No, it's based off of the tax increment, Madam
That's
Chairman.
so that again is based
your
on
sales tax
projected
capacity
tax
side,
increment.
it's tax increment.
Okay, so.
And the program, excuse me.
So
Madam Chair.
another thing I might suggest is these guys, bless their hearts, are very risk averse, and they should be, and that's absolutely what we expect from them. But we may want to be in a situation where we consider a little more risk in our sales tax capacity. It puts us at risk if we do not create the revenue in our taxing districts to pay it back. because then it comes out of the general fund, but it's something I think as policymakers we need to have an opportunity to consider is, are we willing to take a little more risk in projecting our future revenue stream based on some project we might do as an initial investment.
Can I piggyback on that, Madam Chair?
absolutely.
I really appreciate you setting up that context. I think we're going to dig into it a lot more, but I want to overlay as we consider, as we think about considering a more risk-averse scenario, perhaps, that we have a $21 million affordable housing component in our toolbox that we intend to have a lot of discussion about how we distribute that money, but I think that could act as a catalyst, a way for us to further leverage investment in an area really strategically. I'm not talking about a blanket project area investment with the $21 million, but anyway, I think that there are tools in our cadre that could allow us to securely take or have a conversation about increased risk in certain project areas.
Stan?
If I might just follow up on Board Member Mendenhall, I'm not suggesting that I was only using power lines as an example, but it seems like a really expensive project up front, and that it could kickstart some investment or inspire some other people to invest in the neighborhood. It could be a lot of things. It could be a housing development. It could be an actual commercial development. It could be streets. It could be it could be a lot of options. I think the challenge for us is to look at what the opportunities are and which project or which commitment early on in a district would inspire the most comfort level in people investing on their own quickly as a follow-up. The other thing I think that I just feel compelled to remind the council of is that we have also had conversations about the reality that we may not want to say the only thing that happens in an RDA district is funded by the RDA. And a catalytic project in a district area could be a general fund CIP project. It could be a different revenue source for an infrastructure program. And several years ago, Mayor McAdams, when he was Senator McAdams, floated a bill at the legislature that would have allowed us to collect additional fee on our utility bill to fund undergrounding power lines throughout the city. So there are other creative ways we could look at projects that we want to accomplish in an RDA area, and I think we really hinder our ability to do RDA areas a good service when we say the only source of revenue for a project in that area would be an RDA source of revenue.
Eric, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to say what Stan said about, pairing CIP strategically in our RDA project areas. I think that we can be strategic in the way that we wear both our RDA board hat and our city council hat. To get more out of our newly drawn RDA project areas. My question to bond council here, or to our bonding representatives, is looking at budget amendment number 3, the next item on our agenda. I just want to make sure I fully understand what we're getting into if we decide to adopt the budget as it is, for instance, and how that might impact our ability to use RDA sources for repaying a sales tax bond. And I don't know if you could just help me understand, if we were to move forward, let's say with station center improvements and undergrounding and 9th South streetscape improvements, would that remove our ability to issue this $20 million bond as you laid out?
So I don't believe that they have seen budget amendment number 3, so I don't think that they can make a recommendation pertaining to budget amendment number 3. But the base budget does not have budget amendment number 3 in it, so you're correct. It would lose your ability to budget or bond for the whole $20 million, and it may be something different.
So I think this is a discussion that's really important for us to have in light of the budget amendment coming up, because do we want to spend our cash on undergrounding and streetscape improvements if we can be more strategic? I don't think anybody disagrees that we should make some of these investments in infrastructure, but I think the way we go about funding them is a real policy discussion that we need to be having. And frankly, I would be more interested in looking at doing a bond where we could fund the Depot District, we could fund all of the needs in the Granary District, including, the infrastructure needs in order to get the fleet block developed. 9th South, anything on North Temple that might be in the pipeline. If we could be more strategic and get more with a larger investment, I would be excited and ready to have that conversation.
James?
Chair. I'm with you, Derek, on that. I just think cash is king. When you have cash and you spend it, you don't have any more, right? And giving ourselves an opportunity where we create something bigger that's more catalytic. I mean, we've heard about special gateway districts from 5th South and 6th South and undergrounding those power lines. Is this the opportunity where the Downtown Alliance and the Chamber have already done a bunch of research with the city that we go in and actually talk to them to figure out if this is another project that we can incorporate with it? We're talking about huge projects that we would be undergrounding and infrastructure, and maybe this is the time where we talk to Downtown Alliance about SAAs and creating those areas to help pay for these types of areas.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I see the value in, burying utility lines, and I'd like to follow up with Rocky Mountain Power and I noticed that the estimate had almost doubled from October to today. And so I'd like to strengthen my understanding of where the cost really is there. But from an economic development standpoint, I think it's pretty obvious why it's important. But to James' point, if we are looking, if the state is driving, the county and the Downtown Alliance and the Chamber of Commerce are all driving the undergrounding of the utility lines on 5th South and 6th South, why don't we have a financing conversation for all of those projects, including the undergrounding on 1st South, which is also an RDA project area? And if we're going to spend cash on undergrounding on 9th South, and that removes our ability to bond for the other projects, I just feel like we might not be acting as strategically as we should be.
Further comment? Karen?
Turn.
Stan?
I wanted to bring up that I think that the board might want to have a conversation. There's a lot of policy conversations that we will get to in our next agenda item here. And one of those could be about creating a policy about revenue from land sales. And isn't it possible that we could use revenue from RDA-owned land sales to fund a bond?
Madam Chair and Board Member Mendenhall, those monies would be program monies as well. So if you have, if
That'd be under the
RDA
program
owned,
income fund.
those would become program funds.
Okay. What other funds would be broken out under program income funds that I might be seeing separately right now?
Staff's probably here that could comment better than I could.
I'll
but
ask them
those
in
would
the
be
budget item.
Those would be other items where you're managing projects that generate revenues. So you have loan income that comes in. Basically, it's what you've invested in over the past that now generates revenue.
I have a question about the fund balance question item in here, where we might want to clarify whether a certain percentage of fund balance is needed for project areas. And in this budget amendment, which you're not looking at, we're looking at an administrative proposal to spend quite a bit of that. And so, Mary Beth, I think it's more for you. Is there, can you clarify a needed amount, whether it's a percentage as we do with our general fund?
We've been looking at all funds. It's something that is a conversation for all funds, not just RDA, but enterprise funds and internal service funds, governmental immunity, fleet, refuse. We are looking at right now between 5 and 7%. I think that we're going to look at developing a policy around this because a lot of those funds just don't know where their fund balance. But remember that it's not just fund balance, because fund balance is taken up by budgets. It's their cash on hand. And so you need to combine both fund balance and cash on hand when you're speaking about the RDA or internal service funds or enterprise funds. General fund, we only look at fund balance, but in those other areas, we look at net position and cash combined together. If they have enough cash, but their fund balance is low, then we kind of weigh both of those together.
Thank you.
Stan?
Just one more question for council. crystal ball time. It still appears like it's cost effective to look at bonding for some situations and some projects. Any trends you're seeing? Any expectation of that changing? I know there's a lot of chatter, but I don't think we've actually seen a huge shift. The airport just got some pretty good rates on their bonding for their project. What's your sense there?
Well, rates have sort of, even with the Fed increase, bond rates have sort of stabilized, and it's partly due to the bond supply is very low. We typically see between 7 and 10 million, or 10 billion in a week, and it's at 5 billion right now. So that's keeping rates lower. Plus, these are long-term rates versus the Fed increase affects short-term rates.
So our rates are
but-
pretty good.
Yeah, they're good. I think when I ran the numbers back in February, it was still a sales tax bond is about a 350. And it's still that way today. I mean, they've come up, they've come down, but they've come down again.
They're still
So,
staying in a pretty reasonable area. And did you weren't charged with looking at any other creative payment structures for bonds? You were just charged with taking amount that was provided to you and running the numbers for how that.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Other questions? Then I have a couple. So when you looked at this, you did not look at revenues that could come from other project areas, or did I understand that you can't combine, that legal told you couldn't use one for another
So, Madam
area?
Chair, the tax increment revenue is restricted with minor exceptions for housing, for example, or something else. You don't have portability of moving tax increment from one project area to another
Okay,
project
so
area.
I
You can
understood
do
that.
infrastructure outside the project area that benefits the project area, but
And then,
Madam Chair, could I just
yeah,
have a follow-up on that?
Absolutely.
So if housing is an area, low-income housing, could we bond for our low-income housing and pay for it with revenue generated through any of the districts? Or are there restrictions as to how we can allocate that out per district?
Madam Chair, Board Member
Yes.
Penfold, so the money the revenue that is designated from your tax increment revenue for citywide housing, for example, if that's a revenue stream that you can identify and project into the future, and your financial advisors could look at that, I mean, that's available legally to bond for projects. So in other words, there's not a restriction that says you can't bond for that. If it's a revenue stream you can identify and quantify, you could bond against that.
So that would be a situation where we could actually do a project that we bonded citywide and funded from, but that's because the revenue stream already is allowed to provide for that broad-based citywide low-income housing fund.
Yes, so you'd have to look at each of your sources of generating that citywide housing money and see whether it's going to continue in the future. What the
Right.
levels of that would be.
But we have some history with that and a percentage that we allocate every year, so that would be a reliable source. So thank you, that's a helpful clarification.
that was
Thank you.
part 2 of my question, and part 3 is, could we ever tap into the revolving loan fund as we pay for bonding?
Madam Chair, so the redevelopment agency has sponsored a revolving loan fund. And I'm not as familiar with that as staff is, but I'll venture an educated guess on that. If that is a program fund, similar to the other sources of program funds, those could be dedicated to repayment of your bonds. The RDA statute is quite broad in terms of what you can use as a source to repay your bonds. So if it's legally available for those sources to fund it directly, you can generally use it to pay the bonds that would fund those projects.
Okay, any further questions? I'm sure we'll have more conversations in the future. Thank you so much. Do you have anything else you want to add that you think we need to know? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. And we will move on to the Big E, the budget, RDA budget amendment number 3. And as I mentioned earlier, I would appreciate it if board members would be red flagging those things that they feel like we could put into a motion sheet and adopt today. And, or if you think we can go with the whole thing, then we can be prepared to do that. But I I want to start with the staff report, and I'd like to ask Jennifer Bruno to come up along with, is Ben joining you as well?
And
Okay.
Cindy. I think we were going to start with the attorney's office going over quickly.
I can't hear you.
Sorry. I think we were going to start with the attorney's office quickly
Yes,
going over
thank
the
you, thank you.
commitments. Nope, you're okay.
I was looking at one agenda, not the other one. So we will start with Katie Lewis, who's going to educate us on RDA and what our commitments are in terms of legally, the things that we've done in the past, so that we know going forward monies we have available and monies we don't because they're already encumbered. Thanks, Katie.
Hello, Board. Katie Lewis from the Salt Lake City Attorney's Office. Nice to see you all.
Welcome back.
Thank you very much. So I was asked to discuss generally the difference between a contractual obligation that the RDA may have entered into and the use of negotiating tools and documents that might lay out, for instance, terms of an agreement but not actually be a contractual obligation. The purpose for that is to help you all determine as you go through the budget amendment whether there are contractual obligations for certain proposed expenditures or whether there are not. So I'll start with just the general analogy to what the city does for contractual obligations. So the city has City Ordinance 3.25, and that lays out specifically what it takes to make a contract effective against the city. The RDA doesn't have an analogous policy, and the first recommendation that our office would make is that you all consider adopting a resolution that creates that analogous policy, so it's very clear going forward that there is only a contract against the RDA if certain things have occurred. So in the city, the following things have to occur for a contract to be effective.
Madam Chair, Katie, can I just, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but for clarification, do we need an independent policy or do we need a policy that references the RDA to the already existing policy with the general fund?
Is your question whether you could just refer to City Ordinance 3.25?
Right. Could our policy be that we will comply with city ordinance?
Absolutely,
Okay.
unless the RDA, the one
There may be
wrinkle that I
some-
would see is their city ordinance requires as a final step for the document to be attested by the city recorder. And our office recommends that all documents go through, all RDA contracts go through the city recorder as well, but there may be some discussion about whether that's necessary. So if there were different conditions that you wanted to add, you might want to create a standalone policy.
So, Madam Chair and board members, I personally prefer situations where we can, as the RDA, refer to people to existing code if that works, rather than replicating code or policy. And I understand fully that there may be exceptions, and I know that there are some different legal requirements, but I think it's important that the board discuss whether we want to comply with city requirements regardless of whether or not they're state required with the RDA. So I think that I know a couple situations where that could come up, including the budget and our process with the budget and public announcements. So I hope that we would consider not duplicating anything we don't need to duplicate.
Sure. So I'll just quickly go through what the conditions are under 3.25, and you can be thinking about whether there might be any changes that you'd want to make for that. So for a city contract to be effective, it has to be reduced to writing, approved by the department director or whoever's empowered to negotiate it. Funds have to be certified to be available by lawful city budget. The document is approved as to form by the city attorney, and the contract is executed by the mayor or the mayor's designee, or if it's a city council contract, the council chair or the chair's designee. And the signature is attested by the city recorder. So then on the administrative side, there's an administrative process for ensuring that those steps occur, and that's the CAMP process that the city has for all contracts. And the critical part of that for the RDA's purposes is that the first step is that finance has to sign off that there is a cost center that actually has appropriated budget for the contract. So before it ever comes to our office to be approved as to form, and before it's ever executed by the mayor or the mayor's designee, or the council chair or the chair's designee, that budget is assured that there's a cost center that has been assigned to it. So currently the RDA's process is less formal, and the contracts are signed by the executive director and by whoever the third party who's contracting, and they're approved as to form by the city attorney. But there's no CAMP document on the front of it that ensures that there's a cost center, and there's no policy document like City Code 3.25 that lays out what would be required to make the contract effective against the RDA. So we think that might be a great starting point, both on the board side and the administrative side, to come up with a policy from you all, and then also an administrative process for how those contracts are routed through the RDA.
Madam Chair, occasionally we run into situations where I don't think there's any malicious intent, so I don't want to go there. But where we may have in a contract indicated some future commitment, or we may have suggested that the city was willing to do something down the road, but there hasn't been a dollar amount allocated to that. Does this prevent that? Does this, or how do we manage that in like a general fund city project? Because I imagine there are situations where you may or may not know the exact cost until you get farther along in the project. So how do you accommodate a commitment for some additional funding when you may or may not have a determination of what that dollar amount may be?
Sure. So I think there are two things that happen. The first is that whatever financial commitment that is known, there's a cost center assigned to it, so there's never a point where there's a contractual obligation without money at all. But if there are future commitments in that contract, city contracts always have a non-appropriation clause in it, and what that non-appropriation clause says is that this contract is not binding if either the city council or, on the RDA side, the board does not appropriate the funds for that commitment. So we strongly recommend, and we'll be putting in all of the RDA's form contracts, a non-appropriation clause. So if there's ever a situation where a developer says, well, it looks like you committed to this, we can say, well, if there wasn't budget at the time and the board didn't appropriate budget going forward, that's not a contractual obligation for the RDA. But that's how it's handled on the city side. So as Board Member Penfold pointed out, sometimes there can be a concern if there's a contract that's executed and there's not a clear appropriation. And some recommendations that we have to ensure that it's always clear that that's not a contractual obligation without the board appropriation, as I mentioned, would be board policy and administrative policy for contracts, a non-appropriation clause, as I just discussed, and also other language in the contract that would say that it's the entire agreement, and any other side conversations, oral promises, things like that are not binding on the RDA. And then finally, we would ensure that the remedies are such that the RDA would never be forced to sell the property to somebody if they defaulted on the contract. So from our end, those are sort of going forward recommendations that we have to ensure that there's clarity on when there's a contract and when there's not. Now, there are times when, especially on long-term negotiations, there are documents that are exchanged back and forth between the RDA and a developer that are negotiating tools that have, I wouldn't call them commitments, but suggestions on what the parties would agree to if they did execute a binding contract. And the process that the RDA typically goes through is they issue an RFP, they select a developer, they enter into an exclusive negotiation agreement, and then from there, a term sheet is created, and then the term sheet is what is the basis for the purchase and sale agreement. So an RFP, we would always want to ensure that there are no commitments in the RFP of what the RDA would do. Typically, we won't see that because an RFP is really an offer to the community saying, tell us what you're going to do. But we will always ensure that the RFP won't include commitments that would bind the board in terms of what they would appropriate in the future for the project. Then in an exclusive negotiation agreement, we're going to ensure that the same language that I talked about for purchase and sale agreements are in that agreement. So non-appropriation language and other language to ensure that there's no contractual commitment to spend money without the board's appropriation. Typically, they wouldn't be, because an exclusive negotiation agreement is just saying that the parties will work together exclusively to decide whether they can actually execute a purchase agreement. So then a term sheet is the next document that really starts to lay out what the parties are going to agree to. And those documents, we would always say that a term sheet is non-binding because it's not actually signed by both parties. But it can lay out what the developer is going to do and what the RDA is going to do in exchange. And so a developer could say that those were commitments made by the RDA. So we want to be careful on that. And going forward, we want to ensure that there's language that says they're non-binding, non-appropriation language, and also assure that the term sheets don't say things like the RDA commits to construct this infrastructure. So we're going to be working on that, but you may want to consider in your policies thinking about ways to ensure that all documents have non-appropriation language and all documents have these non-committal languages, so you never are in a position where a developer comes to you and says, but the RDA committed, the RDA staff committed the RDA to pay for this based on this term sheet. That's about all that I have, except for to say that some of the questions that have arisen in this budget amendment that have to do with whether there's a contractual obligation or not, the questions are really coming up because the term sheet may have been negotiated prior to sort of the change in separation of powers, or there was a different way of appropriating money, as we all know. So I would say that this discussion that you're having today will hopefully clean up the last of the questions of whether it's a contractual obligation or not. And going forward with the suggestions that we've made and that I've shared with you, there should be a clear process of when an appropriation needs to be made, and after that, the contractual obligation will occur.
Questions? Eric.
Thank you very much for that,
You're
Katie.
welcome.
So just to be clear, moving forward, our policy is to have internal counsel, you and your team, draft up these agreements to ensure that we're following all of these updates that you just laid out for us. Is that correct?
Correct. And the board actually adopted a policy that said that all RDA work will first be done by the city attorney's office, and on the rare occasion, it would be given to outside counsel. So yes, we will be controlling all of the forms going forward.
Can you remind me what the rare occasion might be?
So bond counsel is a great example. Other examples where there might be litigation or something that is, and we have a great team of litigators, so maybe that's not a good example, but the specific expertise that we might not have in-house. But typically, all of the transactional work will remain with the city attorney's office.
Thanks.
Other questions? Katie, I'd love to ask you if you could, in the next couple of weeks, maybe put together a flow chart for us that summarizes what you just said. So it walks us through, okay, this happens and then this happens and then this happens. How we get from RFP to contract.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to.
Okay.
And Madam Chair, in that
Great.
process, Katie, I think you're already doing this, but where are we covered in existing city code, and where might there be why might there be reasons and situations where we might want to exempt the RDA from the specifics of an established city ordinance? And I think there are probably going to be some.
Great, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really helpful. And now, with the drum roll, we will start on Budget Amendment number 3, and inviting Cindy Gush-Jensen, Jennifer Bruno, and Ben Lutke to join us at the table. And I've asked Cindy if she would kick us off with maybe an overview of what your understanding I've asked for.
Yes, that's what we'd like to do, is tell you what we think our assignment is, and then you can correct us or tweak what we believe the assignment to be. So traditionally, the RDA budget has been looked at by the board on a project-by-project basis. And on that basis, really, I can't think of a project that isn't very deserving of maximum funding. The problem is that there are projects that are included in the strategic plans, in the community discussion process, in previous budgets that were partially funded, in all of the elected officials' wishes, hopes, and dreams, in developers' hopes. Those, if you combined all of those things, there's absolutely not enough money to do them all. So we think that we are assigned to look at the budget from a bit of a different lens than the traditional way that the board has looked at it in terms of project by project. So we think that our job is to bring additional context, the context of the RDA budget as it relates to the city budget, as it relates to general fund CIP, as it relates to impact fees, and also in the context with the long-term maintenance costs that may become the responsibility of the city and that type of thing. So I wanted to use the example of undergrounding power lines. Absolutely, when you're looking at that as a basic concept, it feels like it's a no-brainer. It absolutely should be done. And I have no opinion really on whether it should be done or not. But I think our job is to ask the question, is the undergrounding of power lines when you look at all of the tools in the toolbox of the RDA as the funding body, the tools that you would fund, is that the most significant tool that you want to use? Do you want to encourage its use or discourage its use, or say that you have certain criteria for its use? Do you prioritize it as the highest priority, a medium priority, or what? Because when you're looking at that whole ball of things, of everything in the strategic plans and elsewhere, are you okay if that gets funded and some of the other things that you want does not get funded? The other thing is that we're looking for policies. Is there anything that the council could or the board could put in writing that's an appropriate policy that could help inform the work of the RDA so that the board doesn't think they've communicated and then need to have the same conversation many times? Is there some information that could be put in writing that the board members agree on, that the staff can just know and run with? And that makes the RDA, like the administration, more information they have about where the board is going to emphasize and what they're willing to fund and that type of thing, then the more flexibility they have in doing their job. So that's what we're looking for, is context and opportunities for the board to do some policies that that help with the flow of things and allow the board to exercise its authority over the funding of RDA. So if we need you to push us back in the right direction if that is not where you want us heading.
Board members? Stan?
Madam Chair, Cindy, I don't, my intent is not to throw you a curveball, so I hope I'm not going to do this, but one of the challenges we faced with the RDA and the City Council, which I always find a little ironic because we are the same people, is...
We find that ironic
yeah,
too. But
what opportunities do we have or what opportunities might we miss because we put on RDA hats and then we take them off very deliberately and put on City Council hats? And have you given consideration to how through the budget process we might more be aware or even maybe appropriately look at funding revenue streams for projects that might cross what we have considered pretty traditional boundaries?
Yes.
So could you just talk to that for a minute?
Sure. Our long-term dream would be to see a way, it would take probably some more administrative resources, and the administration has been making efforts in this regard continually. But if we could have a more robust process in the city that helps to wed the RDA revenues that might go to capital at the discretion of the board and the RDA management with the CIP process and the impact fee process. We're doing that on an informal basis now. During the last budget, I think we were able to point out some things that that allowed RDA funds to be freed up so that you could use impact fees to fund RDA projects. We want to keep working with the administration on that, and hopefully recommend to the board resources that they would need in order to make that a really robust process to maximize all of those resources. Jennifer, probably. Oh, yeah, the timing, this is going to be really helpful. The administration will be presenting the mayor's recommendation for the RDA budget at the same time as the city budget is presented, and we'll be processing them at the same time. And it'll probably be somewhat difficult the first year because that's kind of a capacity issue for us and probably for the administration too, but that should help. We'll be seeing everything in the same context. There are probably 100 other ways that there can be opportunities for synergy. Let me use one more example, and that is the effort that's going on right now with State Street and the RDA planning there. It is standard, I understand, for RDA to check with all of the city departments to see how there can be shared opportunities, shared vision, shared projects even. The more robust that can be, the greater benefit to the city, because the city is having some needs in those same areas where the RDA districts are being created. And coincidentally, the boundaries are expanded based on the homeless resource centers being located there. So there's a huge opportunity there for the board to look at how to bring together the funding resources of all of the city departments with the RDA in a really cohesive way. So that can go on without the RDA's strategic effort that they're doing, but it just seems like a golden opportunity for the administration and the council. So we are conscious of that. We're trying. We're probably just barely scratching the surface.
David.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the Attorney's Office may want to opine on this as well. I'm not sure, but as we talk about, and I have a horrible habit of stating the obvious, and so if I'm doing that again, I apologize. As we talk about the possibility and the potential of utilizing non-RDA funds within the RDA impact fees, CIP, we know that there's some legal restrictions on where and how RDA funds can be used outside of project areas. Do any of those concerns or restrictions exist within the impact funds or CIP, the reverse?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. There are all kinds of restrictions, and that's why I said it's almost a resource issue, because as a city, we haven't had the capacity previously to figure out all of the restrictions on the impact fees and all of the restrictions on RDA and all of the restrictions on other resources, and then find the path forward that does exist to maximize those resources. So last year we were able to do a little bit of that, but without having a person not in the legislative branch, probably in the administrative branch, that has the time and the assignment to identify those things, it'll be tough to make that more robust.
If I could just one follow-up question is, I don't know how long I'm able to continue to say that I'm new, but
Keep
I'm going to
going, yes.
keep going.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, as we talk about that, the new world in which we're operating, funds that maybe were not considered, is it fair to say that in our current processes, in the administrative process around CIP and impact fee, we as an administration have not at this point incorporated exploring RDA project areas within those two processes that we have set up?
I think everybody has that as their goal, and everyone wants to do their best at it. I think everyone has so many other assignments that it's difficult. There were, I think, 3 projects last year that were in the RDA budget. We checked to see whether those were impact fee eligible, and they were, but we didn't really quite have the mechanisms to make that flow smoothly. So it's, I would say, a work in progress. I don't know if it's something that, I know that there are administrative staff people who recognize that they're trying to keep an eye on that, but I don't know if it's been a priority at the elected official level in either branch, just because there's so many other priorities.
And just to add to that, there are many, many, many projects funded by the general fund in RDA project areas that aren't necessarily expressly coordinated with RDA strategic plans. They might be a priority of the department, whether it's public services or streets or something, that aren't necessarily expressly checked with RDA strategic plans to see, is this the most effective use of general fund dollars, given this year, or, could we wait a year and build on this other RDA project that's coming down the pipeline, or things like that. Again, just because having that strategic look hasn't been a priority because, again, bandwidth, but it happens. And so it sort of happens on a one-off basis as opposed to a planned basis and a coordinated basis.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Anything else any questions on that? Then I want you
Madam
just to
Chair?
start. Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
That I think, Cindy, you're probably exactly right, that there's 100 ways that we could go about alignment, and that largely there aren't resources to do many of those at the ready. But I wonder in our means of communication with other cities, and even just reading in some of the journals and things, that if there isn't some sort of software out there that could, I don't know, that could be one of those 100 tools that help us find the path, the shared path that leverages money better for cities, because that landscape is obviously continuously changing, but it's probably going to change a significant amount in the next 4 years for cities. And we need to leverage our money more than ever before. So I guess I want to throw out there that whether in that RDA hat or the council hat, that I would really love to learn if there's some big tools out there, and that might be staffing too, and it probably is both. But I'm warm to those conversations, because what's $10,000 here but could be $80,000 when we combine it with some other smaller dollar amounts from other areas, because we're thinking about it. Those dollars are so important. So anyway, if you find that there are resources like that, please let us know.
We did meet quite a few times with the previous administration to look at things like that, and we concluded that the potential's huge for the opportunities. We looked at software, found that yes, it could be benefited by software, but not without the staffing to deal with it. And it was probably a smaller component than just the base work that needed to be done amongst entities. So resources, absolutely. And I think they're resources well worth it. And Laura and I haven't discussed this or anything, so I'm just blurting this out in answer to the question. But and the administration may have a different view, but our experience has been that anytime we can invest in getting more information among the various funding sources, there's an opportunity to save money or spend money in a more effective way.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with number one. Do you want to say anything about the new budget template?
Just to mention that there is one, and it's attached to the staff report. Hopefully that made it easier to find than in the
Thank you for that.
900 pages. And it separates out, I think, in a, in my humble opinion, a more readable way, the restricted and unrestricted funds. As we know, there are agreements with taxing entities, and so a lot of the revenues that the RDA receives are sort of contingent on them being spent in a given way. And so this was sort of the first crack at trying to separate out of the funds that are received by the RDA what are restricted for a specific thing and what are unrestricted. I think that said, it's again the first draft, and so if you have thoughts or feedback, I think finance has told us that we're welcome to give feedback, and I would assume that applies to you too. That kind of leads into the next point, which is clarifying the restricted funds. I think what we discovered in working through all the documentation is that there is this spectrum of what restricted means, and Katie covered it, so I don't want to kind of go back into it, but really just to draw your attention to the chart on page 2 of the staff report, just to kind of draw a budgetary figure to projects that are sort of already essentially, whether they're legally or implied, committed. So what's requested in this budget amendment is $13.3 million. But then through those documents, it became clear that there will be more that will be coming that the board will kind of be, either practically speaking on the hook for, or sort of on the hook for just from a progress of discussions standpoint. So if you have any questions about that.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I want to start a list of potential policy needs, and we've gone through 2 of them already without stopping. So I don't know if Ben, maybe you want to start that list and we could get around to straw polling it later. But I want us to talk about incorporation of general fund CIP definition into RDA policy in a formal way. And then also, I like that suggestion under number 2 that we consider adopting a policy to guide future discussions, clarifying that projects are not considered approved until full funding is approved and by a vote of the board.
And I'd like to
I agree.
ask that we have that policy ready to look at and adopt as soon as is feasible.
And I think the discussion earlier, I think this is maybe dovetailing with what Board Member Penfold was saying about, I think there's 2 approaches you could take to that. You could either adopt an RDA policy saying, projects aren't to go forward until full funding is approved, or you could just reference
3.25.
the city process for contract approval. So really up to you guys. Maybe we could draft both and then have you discuss.
Well, and I think just having the policy conversation, whichever, what I think I'm hearing is that everyone is thinking we want to go down that road. What it looks like when we're finished is to be determined. Am I right on that? Any thoughts on that? Okay.
Well, Madam Chair, I also want to make sure we're clear from the RDA staff perspective what that means. We can say whatever we want here, but does it mean it changes things on the ground level for getting things moving to get towards us? So I'd like to hear back from them specifically about anything that we're going to identify as possibilities. What are the effects on what they do day to day?
Okay, very good. Thank you.
And we can follow up with staff and try to include that the next time we'll talk about it.
I mean, and I think we captured this earlier, but there may be some appropriate exclusions from existing city code for the RDA. We should just at least be aware of those and have a conversation about them. But I think we can call those out either in a policy we draft independently or in a reference to the existing code that we want to follow.
If I might suggest that we bring an outline to the board of components that could be either in a separate policy or related to that. There are, I think, what Councilmember Johnston was saying, the practice of the RDA has been so different than the city, very appropriately so, but now that's changing. There's probably some more specifics that we would include in the list of policies that that wouldn't be relevant for the city. So we'll take a best shot and run it by the administration. They may run a draft by us too. We'll see what we end up with and try to consolidate as much as we can.
Andrew?
This may be distracting us a bit to go back to the previous point that Board Member Mendenhall made, and also to reference back to George Chapman from early on in this discussion about public engagement in this process. From your previous work with the previous administration and this administration on this particular issue about how do you coordinate between all the various funds and parts of the city, right? How do we get the funds working together for mutually shared objectives? Was it discussed about how do you bring the public in through open data?
Yes, there's all kinds of best practices about that on a national level, and also some local experts really on the topic. So you can be very elaborate about it if you want to, or you can be very basic. Council member Charlie Luke, who's not able to be with us tonight, had made a suggestion about adding transparency to the overall city CIP process, and you by making more information available on the web. Basically, if you click on an address, you can see what the city projects are relating to that area. Other people have suggested that getting much more feedback from the public, besides our public hearings and besides the process on the administrative side that is managed to have the board, CDCIP board, deal with some of those things. We're doing a lot now, more than most cities, and there's a lot more that can be done. And we can give you some examples.
Yeah, I think the thought in my head was we're trying to solve a specific problem. A specific problem is we've got RDA funds, in various pots of money, right? We've got city funds in various places, and all of them have certain restrictions on them, certain strings attached, essentially, right? And it takes people to go through and figure out each one of those funds, how it can be used, how it can't be used, how it interacts geographically with other funds in the city, and then overlay that with our objectives that may be geographically centered, right? That's a specific problem. We don't have the bandwidth from a city side, right?
Correct.
For a lot of things, but this particularly. Have we looked at saying this is a defined problem? We have all the data that we need somebody to figure this out with, and go to the public and say, who wants to solve this or come up with ideas?
Sorry, go ahead.
We actually did talk a little bit about that. I think it might be an overstatement for me to imply that we have all of the data that we need, or that we could even spare the bandwidth in either branch to engage with the public in that process. So I think that would be nice, but we're not there.
Okay, it seems to me that we have specifics enough. We could figure out, here's the basics overall of this and get ideas. Because one way to engage the public on North Temple, for instance, is to say, look, North Temple has an RDA area, defined geographic area. Here are the funds we can use for this. Here are the other city funds, and we have specific, even if it's not exhaustive, it's a group of things, and say people have a big stake in making North Temple work. How would you do this? It's open data as to saying, how would you, proposals, a lot of them might be junk, right? But it's one way to engage a broader sort of wisdom and figure out, are there ideas out there that we just don't have the time to get to flush out and give feedback? I don't know that it takes a ton of time from us, other than getting the stuff together, putting it out there and saying, come back to us, giving me feedback, some person just to listen to them and write stuff down. And then you can have discussions, but it gives us more input and more ideas and an engaged public, to George's point, with very specific objectives that matter to them in their geographic neighborhood. Central Ninth, for instance, in this matter, right? Really wants utility lines buried and so forth. And
I think truthfully, I think a lot of that happened in the creation of the RDA project areas, and the RDA staff could probably speak to it a lot more eloquently than I just observed it. But they had a really robust community engagement process in developing, especially since those are two newer plans. And the West Temple Gateway having its own strategic plan. I know there was a lot of outreach to the local community about what was important to them and what projects are important to them. I think what Cindy was getting at before, though, was a more interdisciplinary, interdepartmental coordination. And just to your point, it's not just data. The best example, truthfully, that we found of cities that did it the best was the city of Austin. And they had a staff of 10 people that were in the mayor's office. And the crucial piece of the mayor's office is that they were able to coordinate among the departments and essentially pick winners and losers because, of course, they don't have enough money to do everything either. But they were able to say, oh, Public Utilities has this project at the same time as the RDA wants to do this other project in this area. So we're going to pick those two because they'll be able to be done together and we'll maximize the dollars. And they figured that out through also investing in their GIS tools. But it took a mayor to decide that that was a key focus of their administration to organize their staff in that way. And so for us, it's a little bit more than just us on the legislative branch pointing out, hey, there are funds that could be, maximized here. It's also just deciding that it's a priority for the administration to organize in a certain way. And so
that's two different things in my mind. So
right.
The prioritization is one thing, but the GIS tool is a separate thing. And
Right.
if we're lacking in the GIS tool or software, however you want to put it, or the ability to synthesize various points of data the city has and overlay them with each other and figure out on a little easier way for all the staff to make these prioritizations, are we lacking in that tool?
yes.
Yes.
Then that tool is sort of the objective then, not sort of the prioritization, but the tool.
I think
piece.
No, I don't-
that
I think
tool
both.
alone wouldn't accomplish it, though.
Wouldn't, yeah.
So that's where I ask, can we get the public involved and say, do they have expertise out there that say, we have creative ideas how to get this tool to work? And that's saying, I don't know what it is, I don't know who it is out there, but it's one way to think about this. Instead of saying our bandwidth isn't big enough to do all of it, can we almost subcontract that idea out there? And
You're
make it their
ultimately
idea?
still going to have a pinch point, though, where the elected officials are deciding which projects to fund. And frankly, the mayor and council are weighing not just capital improvement projects, but other needs like police officers and fire and all the other things that the city funds, not just capital. Because truthfully, usually what gets cut is capital improvement in order to fund all the other city stuff. So to me, it's not, you can't think about capital improvement in a bubble. It's all related.
Yeah,
So-
I'm not taking that away, but if I parse those things out and say there's a tool we don't have, at least an effective enough tool for us to engage in that process as a board or as a council or as an administration, is that something that we need to look at in a different way?
I would say that, yes, you do need to look at that, but absent a significant investment also in the staffing, and I understand what you're saying, and I know also that it doesn't make a lot of sense that we couldn't just get volunteer help to do it. I don't know how to do that, maybe someone else does. So we can talk more about it, but I don't personally know how to do that.
Apologize, Madam Chair, if I got us off.
That's okay. Let's talk about changes relating to funding.
So let's see, I think the bullet point before was really just to maybe give a foreshadowing, if you will, of future budget amendment or budget requests to come. I think it dovetails a little bit with the land disposition policy in that RDA staff has mentioned in the past that land sale proceeds in the Depot District could fund some of these future budget asks. But again, I think that's a policy discussion for the board to have about what happens with land disposition. The next few bullet points all relate to orienting the board and public now from where we were in, let's see, October, I think was when we looked at these detailed sheets last time. So there were $3 million in revenues that were reported that were not, it was sort of an inadvertent error in the budgeting spreadsheets. And so that's been corrected. It affected a few different project areas. What that meant is that reduced the amount of available funding to fund different projects. So you'll see in certain ones that certain projects that were funded in the previous budget amendment, for example, are no longer funded now or were withdrawn. And you'll also see some fund balance impacts. The next thing that impacted this budget amendment relative to the last one is that some of the projects themselves increased in cost for various reasons, mostly due to just cost estimate refinement. Not that scope was increased necessarily. So those are listed in the chart on page 3 and 4. So I don't know if anybody has
Madam
questions on
Chair?
those.
Yeah.
Can I
Yes,
bring
go
up
ahead.
another item for our consideration of further discussion and possible straw poll?
Yes, sure.
I think that we need to consider a policy regarding vetting of estimates brought before the board. And that might include better evidence of the assessments done, perhaps some kind of report from the bidders who gave us the estimates. But I calculate a 52% change, 97% increase, another 53% increase on those top 3 projects that are listed here. And given the context of what Katie presented with us and our probable lack of contractual obligation to fulfill some of these, I realize that that isn't actually the scenario of the communications between the RDA and the developers who are building around these projects and have made assumptions in their process based on non-contractual possible promises on our end that the board was not as aware of, I think. So I want to talk about policy that makes it really sparkling clear, both the contract side of it, but that we get the best, most accurate possible estimates on projects so that when they change, because they do, because costs change over time and things happen, unexpected things can happen, we can draw a really clear line as to why those changes happened. And then we can feel secure as a board and the executive director, the mayor, going ahead with project funding. But this kind of inaccuracy to the tune of 97% is not trust building.
Could I just
Yes.
give a little more information? I think I think when the staff came to you on the undergrounding piece, it was very, very, very preliminary with a lot of caution from Rocky Mountain Power, and they couldn't give a better estimate, the Rocky Mountain Power, until they had their engineers look at it. And I think now, even now, it is a very preliminary estimate too.
And it could be
So-
higher.
Pardon, yes, that's my understanding, that it's not like the engineering work is completed or anything. It's that you had a tiny bit of information and that got to one price, and then you got more information by investing in a basic study, and that gives you more information, and then there would be more information at a later date. Can you help me, Laura? Is any of that fair and true?
I understand that, and that we
Okay.
probably can't know everything at the very first moment that we want it. And yet, there are developers in our audience. There's we all have lists of emails from people investing in that area who have been under the understanding that we're going ahead with these projects, while the funding decision makers here don't even know nearly close to the cost in a
Right.
lot of these cases
Yeah.
of what we're talking about. And we don't want to stop projects, and we don't want projects to enter into their work under false notions. And so I'm just trying to get at a more clear and transparent path to the honest numbers. I think if we would have been told back in October how rough these estimates are, that they are probably an underestimation based on lack of depth of study of the project or whatever, then I think it would be a lot more collaborative.
And I think that it's safe to say that even the numbers you have now are as you described. They are very, very, very preliminary. So this combined, what you're saying, this other policy you're talking about also combines with the policy of a study only gives you a little bit of additional information. It is not a signal to the community that you intend to fund the project.
And maybe
is our impression.
So how do we move ahead today? When Lisa says, if we get to a place where we can approve this budget today, this budget amendment, How do we do that when we don't even have a solid number? And we want these projects to happen. I want Central 9th to move ahead with street improvements and undergrounding, but I don't know what we're talking about in terms of how much this is going to cost us.
The general fund has a process for approving capital improvement projects that you approve a CIP project based on an estimate. Usually the estimate is city engineering provides the estimate, so maybe that's a conversation that can be had another time. But if there's a cost overrun, so say the bids come back and they're 5% over, there's actually an ordinance that lays out thresholds where if a project is 5%, or I can't remember if it's 5 or 10% over, that's treated as an administrative function, and there's actually an account that is appropriated by the council every year that is for cost overruns. So it doesn't need to come back to the board, it doesn't need to come back to the council. They just say, hey, we're 6.5% over, we need to draw from this cost overrun account. If it's more than 20% over, then it needs to come back to the council for a discussion. So maybe we could consider in our list of policies another policy like that, but.
Yes, please, Ben.
Oh, go ahead. Yes, okay. This would be very unpopular. One thing you could do is you could express some conditions associated with the funding. One would be that you have the RDA staff and council staff meet with the developer and Rocky Mountain Power to get a clear assessment of where we are and the reliability of the number, and also whether there is any alternative to undergrounding that would allow the developer to move ahead with their project promptly. You could do that, or you could just say, you know what, this was a project that we did under 2 different systems, and it's going to cost a lot more, and we have no idea how much more.
I don't see the cost. I hear you saying that it may be unpopular, but I don't see why we wouldn't explore a conversation with Rocky Mountain Power to get more clarity on at least this number and include the necessary parts of the administration that have to do with the zoning and the height allowances and the fire trucks, accessibility, et cetera.
And some improvements are already existing in the street, but I understand that one of the proposals before you today would redo those improvements. That may create other opportunities too. And I don't know what's been looked at and what hasn't, so.
Okay, I realize that I missed something that I want to talk about, so when you finish talking about fund balance, we're going to go back in the agenda a little bit, okay?
So after the cost estimates discussion, the other main change that was referenced a little bit in the financing tools discussion is fund balance. Previously, when the board adopted budget amendment number 2, there were significant funds sort of essentially left in the fund balances of various project areas at the time. Finance staff and RDA staff and council staff, we weren't sure legally what requirements the RDA had in order to maintain fund balances, and so they were going to explore that. I think since the combined factors of projects being more expensive and revenues being a little less than we thought they were, I think it's just necessitated using fund balance for projects, and so that's reflected in budget amendment number 3. Finance has also since confirmed that the RDA has a little bit more flexibility in that they can use cash on hand, in a sense, kind of like a business, instead of fund balance to be their rainy day fund. It's a little bit different than the way the general fund approaches the rainy day fund model, but probably not inappropriate for an enterprise-like fund like the RDA. So as long as the board knows that up front and is okay with that, I think that's fine. Maybe just to clarify going forward that fund balances aren't necessarily required to maintain in the RDA.
So there is not a percentage required?
It doesn't appear that, but I think that's because, as Mary Beth mentioned, the RDA, because of its revolving nature, because of its loan funds, has quite a bit of cash on hand that's not essentially budgeted. So it's an accounting terms, let's just put it under that umbrella. But in a sense, if there was an emergency that required the RDA to required the RDA board to allocate $10 million for something, there would be $10 million to allocate it from. Now, you'd have to rearrange a lot of decks, a lot of, what do they call it, deck chairs or whatever, but it would be possible. So unlike the general fund, where most of it is staffing and there's not a whole lot of cash on hand that can be freed up quickly.
But it is another reason why you have to be really clear about what is a legal commitment and what is something you're still discussing.
Exploring, yeah. And am I reading this right, that unless the board expressly appropriates these funds, they cannot be spent? They aren't eligible
Right,
for
we'll
spending, right?
Clarify that in a motion.
Okay. And so wanting to back you up to 2D, just having I'd love a conversation a little bit about undergrounding power lines and talking about if this is something that we really want to do, what our policy should be. Should RDA funds be used for this? Should it be some other tool to use it? I think everyone is in favor of undergrounding power lines, but I think maybe we aren't clear on how we want to fund that. Stan?
So something I just kind of like to add to the mix, and I do appreciate that. I think it's appropriate for us to have that conversation about is undergrounding the best thing we can do to enhance development in a neighborhood, and I'm very much a pro underground kind of guy. But I think ranking that in a priority is important. It is an incredibly expensive proposition, and it has been this way anywhere we see it in the city. The other part of it I think that is important is how we look at funding that. And I think this particular situation we find ourselves has sort of illustrated one of my concerns is that it's not probably very cost effective to bury power lines project by project as they come online along a power line. That if we want to make that commitment, we need to be comprehensive about doing it in a way that's most cost effective. And I don't know the numbers, but I can't imagine it's cost effective to go down underground and up again because we have a lot that's got a project and then wait until the next project comes on board. And the reality is we don't own all those properties. So it's going to be more difficult for us to do that along a length of a street rather than in just these segments of the street. So I appreciate that, Madam Chair, that I think what I'm hearing is we should have a conversation about is it something we should be committed to, and if so, how do we finance that as part of an RDA priority?
And I would like to talk a little bit about that financing, because I think there's a number of options. One is bonding specifically for undergrounding. One is looking at a statewide solution along the lines of what you said Mayor McAdams had done, and so that there's money all over the state that's, locally going into that. I know our crack team found out that there's a utilities undergrounding master plan, I believe, in San Diego, and we could look at how they have funded that. There's a master plan to do it, because I think we all agree, and we have, as we've mentioned, we have some big things coming up that undergrounding would be really critical to those that are gateway areas.
And I do think we're at a disadvantage because if you look at brownfields or suburb developments, typically developers are required to underground their utilities as part of their subdivision. And so when you go out into the communities and say, well, there's no power lines out, in Daybreak, yeah, is a good example. That's because the developer put all those utilities underground before they did anything. And either that was a requirement or as something they did as part of their package for making that an attractive development. We have to go in after the fact. And it's, I'm also intrigued with the idea of looking at this at a citywide issue. And it wasn't that long ago that we were looking at 8 South and a massive power line new power line going up to the U that the city refused to pay for undergrounding. Was about $38 million.
$38 million.
And we've got to be able to be really clear with our residents about why here and not there. What do we have some priorities? How are we financing that long term? And if we make a commitment to it, I want to see it be a sustainable commitment to
And
it
in the
as well.
proposed Ninth South undergrounding, it's 1.2 million per block. So that's pretty pricey, but I think we need a policy. We need to have a discussion about having a policy about undergrounding and if it's appropriate for the RDA, and if so, ways to fund it. Or maybe it's a city priority and beyond the RDA districts.
And in the
go ahead.
models that we've seen where there is a statewide opportunity, or one model, I guess, is that each city had the discretion of whether to impose that or to have it imposed. So it isn't, if you sought a state solution, it wouldn't be that it would be imposed on all residents of
Right.
the state. It just is another local tool.
Yeah. Okay. And then also, I think we want to make sure we do have a policy indicating what Cindy was alluding to, that we make it really clear that asking for a study on something is not committing to do what that study recommends. It's saying, we're looking at this. It doesn't mean funding will be coming. It means we're interested in doing it. We're going to see if we can. So I think we need to have a clear policy for that, board members. And are you wanting straw polls on any of these things?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, whatever you're.
So let's back up, and I will propose a straw poll on that we want to develop a policy for the RDA undergrounding power. Those in favor of developing a policy? Yeah. go ahead.
Before that,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I think that I would rather see some sort of master plan for undergrounding in the city, looking at that
Okay.
across the board and seeing it's on a much bigger project if we go out and bond to do undergrounding. So
Okay.
for me, I would rather.
The council side then.
Yeah.
Okay. So Stan, you propose it.
Oh. Maybe James needs to propose it.
Yeah, I'll
Okay, yeah,
propose
go
it. I
ahead.
propose that the RDA fund an undergrounding master plan study, feasibility study for not only RDA project areas, and then the city would fund the rest of the part that covers the city that's not in the project area.
And you want that to include finance options?
For sure. I think everything and all.
So can I modify that? If we're going to go forward with that, we probably ought to just charge the staff with getting us cost estimates before we commit to funding a project. Just going out and getting cost estimates as to what that might look like.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
And I'm okay moving forward with that, Madam Chair. I think there's a concern about what that means for today's budget amendment, and I don't have a recommendation, but I guess I can share concerns. And my concerns are that we're only looking at a limited area where we're proposing to underground something that in the priority says we want to underground it for a lengthy area, and it doesn't feel very cost effective to just do a piece by piece by piece. So I'm a little, and I know there's some timing issues, so I don't quite know how to resolve that.
And I would respond to that perhaps with this overall master plan, we would exempt this area and make a decision on that area today, if we can, what we're going to do. And maybe we have some language in the motion that gives us, if the cost comes back at a certain amount, that then we don't go forward with it. You know, if there's a percentage over the current estimate that it is, or something like that. I don't know, but that's taking us off the straw poll. So, restating the straw poll do you want to take a shot at it, James?
I have a question
Yes,
about
go ahead.
this proposal, James. I want to understand why the master plan, because on the one hand of our conversation today, I feel like, as Stan was saying, that the prioritization of undergrounding might be taken kind of area by area, whether it's in a project area or not, based on the needs of the area and the goal of, investment. And also because master plans tend to cost a lot of money and last a really long time, and the fluidity of particularly RDA project areas, I mean, that's the point of it, right? That we're trying to change the situation I don't know, it makes it seem like we could put a lot of investment into and time into a master plan, and that really quickly it could become irrelevant because of other pressures or developments around. So I just want to understand your case for the master plan.
I'll give you my case. My case is pretty much this. If there's one thing that will not change in the city, it's power lines. They will be there, and they will
So you're
continue
saying
to be there.
billboards we could change?
Well, no, there's no way those are coming down. I'm sorry, I just...
So power
I
lines
can just
and
tell you
billboards.
from experience, those are not coming down. But for power line's sake, they're there. I think this is an opportunity for us to actually master plan it and figure out which are the most feasible to do faster in project areas, and then we can actually prioritize the areas. And we know that Central 9th is hot, right? So we go through the master plan process. We figure out, well, hey, you know what? There's actually some areas in Poplar Grove or Glendale that are really easy to do that would cost a lot less. That would have a bigger impact in some areas than if we were to say 5th South or 6th South. So for me, it's just, we can prioritize it through a master planning process for the entire city, not just the RDA.
And would you be supportive of what our chair was saying, that we might exempt the Central 9th area and be willing to go ahead with those decisions?
Well, for sure. We'll straw poll those today. I won't be in favor of it. I will be in favor of the streetscapes, but for the undergrounding for 3 blocks for that much, I'm just not. I understand it, but it's a hot area right now, and it's going to continue to be hot.
Okay, thanks for explaining.
Just a minor clarification, because I think it might have been lost in the translation of the all 3 bond memos, because I'm sure all of you read every single word. And so
Riveting reading.
The difference between the last bond memo and the first bond memo is that the last bond memo contemplated a city sales tax bond for projects that were infrastructure, like streets, not undergrounding. And the first memo contemplated a whole bunch of projects, including undergrounding, but it was an RDA bond. RDA bonds are not limited in the way that city sales tax bonds are. In the way that city sales tax bonds, we have to own the asset that we're bonding for. So the city could not bond for undergrounding, but the RDA could, even if the city was using RDA funds to pay the bond. So I think I was trying to describe this earlier and probably not doing it very well. Depending on your goal of what you want to pay for, that would tell you the kind of bond you need to issue, and then you'd figure out, do you have the kinds of money to pay for that? So it caused me to think of it, because opening this up citywide got me thinking that, I wouldn't want you guys to think that you could just make a city bond for undergrounding power lines.
And you could, if you used RDA funds for the bond, it could only be in the RDA areas.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think you could issue an RDA bond in an RDA area for undergrounding power lines.
Right.
Of course, the next question would be, can you afford to pay for that bond
Right.
with
Which
the
was
RDA? Right.
Yeah,
So
the
yeah,
conversation. Okay. So further questions on it, or Cindy, clarification?
Just to clarify, with what Councilmember Rogers was saying about the citywide master plan, were you talking about for residential areas as well as commercial areas? And how do we describe it? Is it an economic development tool? Certainly it is in commercial areas. Is it also in residential areas? Is it an appeal issue, or is it a...
I think it's a betterment for whatever neighborhood you're looking at. If you wanted to be even more dive into the weeds about it, you could say for the urban forester, it's going to save trees, right? Because you're not butchering trees to accommodate power lines.
A betterment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we want to restate it for us, James?
Boy, I don't know if I can.
Okay. Yes, Andrew.
I get the point. I don't see it as an economic development issue, though, if we're going to go citywide. I think that when we're talking about this, we're talking about 2 areas in my head right now, Central 9th and then First South, right?
And eventually 600 South and 500 South.
Sure, but these are very specific.
Well, there's some other areas in the granary. It's 8 South, I think, in the granary area, so.
These are very specific streets that we have specific ideas of plans coming down the pike that say, well, we probably need to get these out of the air so we can have density, height, whatever it is going in that area. To broaden the scope of the city is great. I'd love my power lines to come down. It doesn't mean I'm going to save my trees. I'll probably have to sacrifice a bunch of trees to put it underground, right? But I think if we're going to go that broad, I've got so many other things in my head of things that I'd like to see us do to promote economic development, to promote better cityscapes, those kind of things. where I'm not opposed to the idea, but I don't think this takes priority in my head over everything else we're trying to look at least citywide.
So Madam Chair, and I don't know how to get some direction on this, but I'm not sure we have compelling evidence that says that this is a requirement for economic development. I think we certainly have aesthetic issues that we can all pretty much agree on, but there are significant areas of the city that have developed with power lines. I'm thinking of 6 South in particular, where a massive apartment building just went right up next to one of the major power lines coming into the city on 6 South. So, I'm sorry? Yeah. So there are locations where it happens. I'm concerned about whether we're having a conversation about aesthetics or if we're having a conversation about economic development investment and whether or not that will happen in an area where there are existing power lines. So this is actually, I mean, I know we kind of want to treat this like a simple issue, and it's kind of not.
I'd like to hear Director Fritz respond to that if you want to, but we're putting you on the spot, Laura.
I think there's a number of
Your mic is on.
my mic is on. Sorry about that. Is that better? I think there's a couple of reasons. One, it can be an economic issue. I think that as we look to increase density, there becomes an issue with the power lines being there and construction. I know it is an issue for fire, and I'm not going to speak to them, to their points, because that's way beyond my scope. And then I think there is an aesthetic that goes along with undergrounding, and I think that that does enhance economic opportunity as well. I don't think you can discount aesthetic as part of an economic plan.
And can I ask Fire, do you want to come up and put in your 2 cents on this? Thank you. And when you turn on the mic, will you say your name so we get it recorded? Thank you.
And while they're coming up, I appreciate your thoughts, Laura. I guess one of my concerns is consistency when we're doing this, and because a lot of people are going to want their power buried, and I think that's what we'll hear, and we need to be pretty on solid footing about why we're doing it and where we're doing it and what's the priority for that particular reason. And I'm not arguing that any of those things should be discounted. I just want to be able to really have a solid position going forward that says this is a priority, this is where it fits, this is where we'll try to pay for it, this is where we want a business to try to pay for it, whatever that looks like.
I'm in.
Madam Chair and board members, I'm Claire Baldwin. I'm the Assistant Chief of Administration for the Fire Department. We've discussed this quite a bit, and currently on the 9th South project in particular, the power lines, when they're between the access, which is on the street side, any power line that's on the street side, especially on these distribution lines, these aren't major. These aren't the major transmission lines like on 500 South and 600 South. The buildings can't be built higher than 30 feet, and that's one of the restrictions that gets thrown in immediately with any of these projects, is that if anybody that comes into that area, if they're going to build a building higher than 30 feet, then it applies as it restricts that decision or even that option to go above 30 feet. So it does affect the ability to develop some of these areas.
I think in our conversations, we haven't understood a strict, we've understood there are a lot of alternative approaches, that there isn't a strict prohibition. Otherwise, how would you have the DA building that's right nearby?
There are a lot of exceptions.
Okay, that's the point.
There are exceptions depending on the area, and that's one of the things that was mentioned earlier in your discussion about trying to, you can't make this a blanket decision, and each area does have to be examined. We have to do measurements of the street width. We have to look at the offsets from the building to the street. Is it 15 feet? Is it 30 feet? There's a lot of things that come into play, but definitely the height of the building and power lines on the street side, the access side, do pose some problems as far as fire code is concerned. Power lines that are in a typical neighborhood are in the backyards, and they don't restrict that access. And the same thing would apply for a lot of the commercial buildings as well. A lot of those power lines are in tight alleys that don't fall into that criteria as well.
So let me just say that we are having a lot of difficulty in doing this budget when we have statements that are made unilaterally that we at first accept at face value and say, oh, you can't build higher than 30 feet if there's a power line there. That's pretty obvious. What we need help with from the administration is getting the clarity about, in many cases, you can't do that, or there are exceptions. But what we're finding is that whether it's a bonding issue or a finance issue or a fire issue, we are getting the overall statement as though it's a final rule, and until we push back, we don't get the rest of the information. And I don't know if there's a way that we can say, please help us with the whole picture, as opposed to the general statement. So, sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's
there,
fine.
But that's what we are running into.
We would be more than happy to help in this. Of course, we don't want to do anything that hinders economic development or any of the other projects in the city, but so we'd be willing to help any way we can. Yeah, any
help
other
identify areas that, okay, you can go higher here, you can't here.
Yeah, we would have to come out and
Right.
do an evaluation of any of the potential projects and then determine if it's going to be affected by fire code or not.
Okay.
And there are many mitigation measures that Rocky Mountain Power has recommended. So there are different things, and that's why the Rocky Mountain Power has to do this study. And I don't know if they do it in collaboration and relate it to the codes that the fire department is addressing.
And
or
have we
not.
heard from Rocky Mountain specifically on 9th South on if there's a way
Basic
to do
information.
something other than underground?
They have not met recently with the architect. It's probably worth a meeting. There may not be any other choice, but it's probably worth getting an understanding if the board is wanting that.
So a question I would have is, and I think we need to know this just to be fully informed, is there an option of relocating these power lines rather than undergrounding them? And the mention is that typically you see these not on the street front, but in the backyard or something like that. And I don't know, are they providing service along this line? But is that even an option of relocating these lines to another part of that block?
In some cases, well, Ben might have a little better way to say it.
The one fact that might be helpful is there are circumstances when the power lines are not conforming to current safety codes, and if you don't touch them, that's fine. But if you do try to relocate them, whether it might be underground or behind the development or adjust them in some other way, that triggers the new safety code, and that increases the project costs. I don't know how significantly that is or when exactly that trigger happens, but that's the general process of when you'd have to meet the new safety codes.
See how complicated this is?
And I'm going to ask Ben from the RDA has some information on this. If you'll make a little spot for him there, we'll have him. And Ben, state your full name. State your full name so that we have it on the record. Thanks.
Okay. So just to add some information based on conversations Ben Davis with the RDA. Just to add to what the chiefs have said, talking with Tedich on building services and some of the, Stan, you mentioned the 600 North project specifically as, well, how come they were able to go, higher than 30 feet without, with those power lines remaining? And the answer to that is there's an alternate means of aerial access, if I'm using the correct nomenclature there. So what they did on that specific project is they combined with an adjacent property owner, and they were able to provide that secondary means of aerial access. So that works really well on the corners, and there's some opportunities potentially in Central 9th on corners where the power lines could remain if there's that second, on a corner, if you use 200 West as the access instead of 900 South. Now, to add a little bit more to that, it depends on how you design the building as well. So from what I understand on the Land Forge project, for example, it's divided up into 2 buildings, and even though it's on a corner, and you could potentially use 200 West as a second means of aerial access, the way that the building is designed, since it's above 30 feet, it doesn't meet the code. So there's some exceptions there. And then other areas around the city that you'll see, well, how come they were able to do that? One example is Green Street property right on 2nd West. I think that's what it's called, Green Street. And the code changed from when that was built to now. And so that was why that's why you see those power lines remaining on that specific project. So I just wanted to add that if that's helpful. So there are plenty of exceptions. It's kind of case by case. It does depend on design and other factors.
And
Very
even
helpful.
things
Thanks.
as specific as the windows, whether they open out, whether they are sliders, whether it's a window versus a balcony, there are all kinds of design issues that come into play. So you may have a fact pattern here where the design is so far down the road that it's impossible to consider alternatives. Or it may be that it's worth taking a look.
Madam Chair.
Okay, yes.
And in that vein, Cindy, I appreciate the way that you're illuminating the complexity of these kind of considerations. I love you, James, but I just don't think the master plan is worth the bandwidth of time and staff investment, because we don't necessarily know what might come down the pipeline in any given area, and things that could become a priority based on change of property ownership or whatever, might not show up on there. And so I think I really like the policy idea about us establishing a policy that has us state the goal of undergrounding, and which may be different from area to area. And if the goal is in this central 9th area, for example, that we allow the height and density of development that is articulated in our strategic plan, which therefore is greater than X amount of feet. And if that's our goal, then it might not be that we have to go with undergrounding. It sounds like a lot of work's been done on this, and I want to learn more. But I guess what I'm saying is we could create a policy that allows us to state what that goal is, and then cooperatively enter into negotiations or a conversation with Rocky Mountain Power, with our utility provider, to talk about all the options that might fulfill that goal. And then we can consider the cost of those options and the pros and cons of those different, if there are options.
Okay, can I have you put that in a straw poll in a minute?
Well, wait.
After James.
Yeah, go ahead.
I appreciate your comments, Aaron. And for me, who's to say that Rocky Mountain Power hasn't already done something like this? Have we reached out to Rocky Mountain Power to find out if they've done some sort of groundwork to find out the areas that they would like to underground, specifically for upgrades or for development prospects? I think for us to reach out to them and see if they'd be interested in help participating in some sort of master plan through, maybe it's just the central business district out to 9th West to State Street, outside of those areas, and keep it within Salt Lake City. But for us to be short-sighted and just say, no, we're not going to do it because it's expensive. Well, these projects are expensive. The things that we have already invested in the city are expensive through light rail and the streetcar. And for us to say, I can't do it just because we are picking up dimes and stepping over dollars for our opportunities in economic development. That's just my personal opinion. So before I agree, maybe we're rushing to straw poll on that, but let's reach out to Rocky Mountain Power and see if they'd have any interest in doing something like that.
I can support that.
So do we want to do a straw poll on, do you want to rephrase it?
If you get married to your own ideas, you're going to lose every time, right? So I'm interested in looking at the core of Salt Lake City and looking at our undergrounding those areas there and reaching out to Rocky Mountain Power to see if they'd be interested in doing that, or maybe they already have some groundwork that they've already done.
Okay, those in favor of James' proposal? Yeah, oh, you want to weigh in on something, Stan?
Just
Okay.
a question. So you said the core. So are you thinking RDA area, CBD? And so are we charging the RDA staff with initiating that conversation with Rocky Mountain?
Okay, with that, So those
I'm
in.
sorry,
yeah,
one
yeah.
more.
Okay, it's okay. We can stay here all night. It's okay. I'm here all week.
I know that it's not simple to collaborate between the branches. There are times when it's more cost-effective to do that. You did a motion on the housing funding that included a collaboration between the two staffs. There are probably some questions that we would ask based on our conversations with the board that may not be items that the RDA staff would naturally pop up with. If you would like us to do a second conversation with Rocky Mountain, we can do it that way. We can see if the administration would be willing to do it in a collaborative way together. So we just need to know if it's worth asking them, or if you want to do it in a separation of powers way entirely and do it probably twice.
So, James, I was just asking for clarification, but I'm fine with suggesting that the council office and the RDA staff look at that, because I know there's some relationships that may be helpful through the council office as well with Rocky Mountain. So I'm fine saying, could we initiate a conversation with Rocky Mountain Power to see what it would take to do this? Because we've got several other proposals in other RDA areas around the central business district, and some that are not even on the table yet in the gateway sort of projects that would fall under proposal for burial.
Comfortable with that if Cindy is. I just don't want to continue to add more and more and more, so.
Oh, well, I know it'll be really up to the administration. A good example is on the bond process that the reason we have 3 memos is that we weren't together in the process, and so there's some times where that works, and sometimes it just doesn't work, so.
I'm comfortable with that suggestion.
And leave it to the administration. If they choose to include, that's great. If not, I just want to make the point that we do have some specifics from council members that we need to include.
Okay, so I'm going to rephrase this and say that we are in favor of exploring our options for undergrounding, be it through a potential master plan, collaboration with Rocky Mountain Power, or otherwise. Comfortable with that? Okay, all in favor of that? Okay, and it's unanimous. We've got 6 of us. Okay. And I think we want to, I know our staff is good at doing this, but we want to be sure part that's administrative, the administration carries, and the part that is not, we take care of. Next discussion, would someone like to propose a policy to make it clear that indicating that studies are funded to better inform decision-making process, not to informally signal that a decision has been made? And do you think we need a policy for that?
It seems so. I'm ready to propose a straw poll to create contract clarity analogous to City Code 3.25, or that we, let me rephrase that we investigate creation of contract clarity in the RDA that may be analogous or may refer to City Code 3.25.
Okay, any discussion on that? Okay, those in favor? Okay.
And then,
that's
but I think
6,
that doesn't necessarily get
and
to the
right, I was
first
to
one.
say that doesn't get to the part of that if we ask for a study. Does anyone want to propose a straw poll on sending that message that a study does not indicate a decision has been made?
Do we want to set that up in a policy?
Is that the best place for that?
So I would propose that we develop a policy that provides guidance around hiring studies to inform the administration and the board as to options and not make financial commitments based on a commitment to a study.
That financial commitments not be made based on the fact that we're doing a study. Okay. Any discussion on that? Okay, those in favor? Okay, that's 6. It's unanimous. Thank you so much. And we're on to item 4. No, we're a little ahead of that. Not much, but a little bit. We talked about 4, we talked about 5, we did fund balance. Do you want to touch a little bit on bonding, or do you think we are sufficient on that?
I think it just relates to the conversation that the board started, but maybe never concluded, about the decisions you make either tonight or whenever you consider the rest of the projects in Budget Amendment 3 do have an impact on your ability to bond.
So bear that in mind, that we need to be careful with how we use the money. So if we want to bond, we can do that. Okay.
In terms of the funding sources for the 17.1 million that was approved in October, a key piece of Budget Amendment 3 proposed by the administration is essentially reconfiguring the funding sources for that allocation so that it frees up funding for some of the priorities that were identified by the administration. So the biggest difference, I think, is in the CBD and the Depot District. It shifts more of the funding responsibility to the CBD and away from the Depot District. So just pointing that out. The other sort of technical note to note is SAR. That was inadvertently left out of Budget Amendment number 3, but the administration intended to have those funds be a part of this 17.1 million. So we could either correct that as a part of this budget amendment if the board was okay with that, or the administration could include it in the next budget amendment. So, but that's how they intended to keep the $17.1 million funding commitment.
And Jennifer, in case any of us still have some PTSD around the SAR and how that was resolved last fall, I think, could you give us a little snapshot of the city's obligation now to SAR, and that the RDA is relieved? Because
so this was a bond that was agreed to that would have been joint funded by the city and RDA, and at the time it was refinanced maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that now. They agreed to backload the debt because even though they knew that the SAR district was expiring and that the RDA wouldn't be able to contribute funds to the debt service, at the same time that those bonds were expiring, the bonds on the Energy Solutions Arena, now Energy Solutions Arena, were expiring, and that the city would be able to use those funds to pay for the backloaded debt. Well, fast forward 10 years, priorities change, elected officials change, and the city is now going to be on the hook for that debt. In fact, that was part of last year's budget. The first sort of big jump in that debt payment was last year. And the city, right, the city CIP. So you saw that in your context of the city council, in the context of the CIP budget, that reduces the amount of essentially pay-as-you-go CIP projects and increases your amount of debt service for about the next 4 or 5 years. And this amount, this $525,000, is essentially interest savings that were left in the SAR account as that project area expired.
And why wouldn't they be reoriented back into the debt service that still remains for SAR?
So they were one-time funds, and because they were interest funds, I don't know if you have a better way to encapsulate it.
Can I rephrase? Could that $525,000 go towards the debt service?
It could not. We at first thought it could, and we were wrong.
Thanks, that helps.
Opinion.
That
attorneys told
eliminates
us
the conversation.
Get over it. You're wrong.
Okay, great.
And truthfully, because it's one-time money, it would only help the pain just a tiny bit this year.
You know, when we get into CIP, though, $500,000 feels pretty good sometimes.
Really, yeah.
Okay, anything else on the 17.1 million?
So just to be clear, there's nothing else proposed for this 17.1 million. The budget amendment number 3 does not propose how to use the 17.1 million. It's just reorienting how the sources are.
Right. Okay, and before we launch into new programs and projects, I'm going to have us take a 10-minute break, okay? I think that everyone's been really well behaved for 2+ hours. So, but I'm serious, at 4:30, I want to start up again.
I need to switch this chair. I feel like I'm. No, it's like tilted. Mine too. It's like tilted forward.
before we jump in to new projects, Board Member Kitchen wanted to back us up for a few minutes to talk about bonding.
Yeah, I noticed that we keep talking about this budget amendment and referring to burying utility lines, and we keep referencing our desire for a bond, but we're kind of dancing around the subject without actually touching on it directly. So I thought maybe we should back up a little bit and look at bonding as a financial tool, that header, and maybe use this as an opportunity to dive into a conversation as a body around our appetite for bonding, to give ourselves individually and as a body, as well as the RDA and economic development staff, a bit of clear direction. So I don't know how you feel about that, Madam Chair and my colleagues here, but that's what I would like to do.
Okay, launch us into it.
So, I don't really know where to begin as far as launching us, but my question that I pitched to Mary Beth earlier when we were talking with our financial advisor, she confirmed that if we were to move forward on the budget amendment as it's laid out, that it would seriously restrict our ability to bond as they had laid out in their proposal. And, knowing that we have maybe capacity up to about $20 million or some other composition of bonding, I would like to ask my colleagues here if we would like to begin that conversation formally about pursuing a bond and engaging with the administration and figuring out where they are at, and pushing that so that we can not only fund some of these projects that are put down in the budget amendment, like burying utility lines, improving infrastructure in the utility lines in the Depot District, but we also have Fourth West, and I think a lot of this gets back to what Councilmember Penfold mentioned earlier. We have an expiring project area in the Granary District, for instance, and not much to show for ourselves over there. So, if we were to maybe look at constructing one project like Fourth West, that could catalyze additional investment and development. And so I see bonding, if we were to look at it more comprehensively in all of our project areas, we might be able to get more bang for our buck than spending all of our cash as it's laid out here in this budget amendment. So that's a little wordy of a launch, but tell me what you guys think.
Aaron, go ahead. And one thing I would just note before you speak, Aaron, is that the administration made two recommendations. One was not to bond for top priority projects, and the other was, and I know you've seen this, but anyone listening to this conversation hasn't seen it in front of us, but they recommend exploring it for other priority projects. Am I restating that correctly, David? Okay. So that part of it, and I don't know if there's a desire to go back and rethink that a little bit. I think part of this conversation also needs to be that right now the proposal for the way we're funding undergrounding is with project income funds, and that is our most flexible money. It can be used anywhere, and so I wonder also if we want to be tying up that really flexible money to that level of money funding in that one area, just for what it's worth. So, but go ahead on the bonding discussion. Go ahead, Aaron.
I wanted to ask you, Derek, and anybody else what your opinions are on this three scenarios that the financial advisors put before us. Because that last one, of course, assumes that there's 3.5 million remaining in the fund balance, which if we approve the budget as proposed for this budget amendment, that money isn't all there. Most of it's not there. But that does give us a $20 million project potential. I just wondered what everybody's thoughts were on which scenario we like, which would then allow us to talk about which projects would be included if we like any of them.
Anybody thoughts? Yep. Okay.
So I'll rattle off the notes I had, which was that there's that January 19th memo that I think was 9 million, and that was the RDA issued bond. And I think that board member Penfold brought up some really valid questions about the assumptions that were made in the presentation to the bond council at that time. And then there was the next day memo on the 20th of January with the city issued sales tax revenue, annual debt of 1.4 million. And that we could enter into that agreement, of course, with RDA, and it would afford us a $17.2 million towards projects. And then the February memo that gets us to 20 million added that fund balance of 3.5 million. And that's really timely to Madam Chair's proposal that we could potentially approve of this budget amendment today. And if we do that, then that eliminates this $20 million proposal unless we come up with about $2.5 million otherwise.
Okay, thank you. Anybody?
I mean, I'm inclined to move forward with our option to bond at $20 million and have staff bring us projects that we could use or that we could fund with that. So I guess I hesitate to tie up our capacity right now. Does that answer your question, Erin?
Yeah, so what's your response to the administration's proposal to use that? So I'm looking at page 4 of our staff report that looks at the project area funds and the fund balances remaining that take our fund balance in this proposal to $92,000 instead of 3.5 million.
So,
Am I confused there,
No, that's
Jennifer?
absolutely correct, that Budget Amendment 3 proposes using all that fund balance that the financial advisor was considering would be applied towards the bond payment. That said, Budget Amendment number 3 also proposes using cash on a number of the projects that are on that list. And so in theory, and obviously we would have to work out the details with the financial advisor and with the administration, but on paper, it would seem that you could use that cash that say 5.6 million in cash is dedicated towards station center infrastructure. There's 10.8 million that's on that list to be bonded for. So in theory, you could take the 3.5 of that 5.6 and pledge it towards the bond instead of the project, which will be accomplished by the bond, still end up with the same thing and move forward.
Not like we wouldn't not be funding projects, we would just be doing it in a different, more
Right.
strategic way.
Right.
Actually getting more out of it, it sounds
Right,
like.
you'd add Fourth West as a project, and you would add Third West as a project this year instead of next year, but.
And I want to
Derek's
clarify, it
gonna
isn't
fly
that
out of his
it's,
seat if you just said Fourth West would be on this.
so it isn't more or less strategic, it's just different. And a lot of times what you do is figure out what it is you would like to accomplish, and then the bond council can determine what the different tools are. Sometimes they might give you 2 different paths to get to where it is you would like to go. So, and then you do need the collaboration with the administration in order usually to do a bond. But sometimes what councils have done is prepared an option and then discussed it with the mayor and massaged it from there. But doing a bond without the administration is much more difficult than. There's nothing simple about it. Might not even be possible. So I would say first step, figure out what it is you'd like to do, and then let the bond council figure it out, and then work with the mayor.
So is it,
At some point in the middle.
May I, Madam Chair? Just so I make sure I'm understanding this, under the scenarios that we've talked about for, let's just use the example of a $20 million sales tax revenue bond that's repaid through RDA dollars. The calculation was based on RDA dollars that we could consider reliable dollars that can be spent in any RDA district. Is that
Right.
accurate?
Right.
So, for example, if we did say that Fourth West, Third West improvements, Ninth South, those projects are priorities for us because those districts expire here in a year, and we'll have our ability to fund those projects will either be limited or non-existent once those areas expire. That we could make a commitment to do that, or we could ask bond council to look at putting together a package that included a number of projects based on estimates and funding to see if they were realistic. And it might include some contribution of existing cash, which would reduce the bond amount, but it would also be realistic based on program income revenue. But the other side of that, it ties up that program interest revenue for the bond period.
But you've achieved that project that you wouldn't have achieved otherwise.
Right. So one of the challenges I think we have, Derek, is that in a comprehensive view, I'm not opposed to doing that. I should clarify that. But in a comprehensive view, one of the challenges I think I experience is, what about the Catalytic North Temple project? Does that get lumped in, or how do you finance that? And what about the new projects that are going to be the catalytic pieces in the new districts we're developing? And one of the concerns I have, I was disappointed, frankly, in sort of the limited scope that bonding options felt like it was presented to us, because for maybe risk reasons, they didn't really consider potential tax increment revenue in those areas. It was a far more reliable source of revenue. And I don't know, I feel like I'm talking in a little bit of a circle, and so I'm trying to focus it for a question. If we were to explore bonding options going forward, do you think, Jennifer, you're kind of the go-to person on bonding, is there an opportunity to look at additional bonding in the future based on either potential tax increment revenue in a new project area, or an expansion of program income revenue?
Absolutely. I think the caveat is always that depends on what you're funding. So, for example, you mentioned the North Temple Catalytic Project, and the one caution that I know is that would not be an allowable use of city sales tax revenue bonds. So you would have to find a way to guarantee the RDA tax increment to fund that bond.
So we have the same issue with underground power lines, right? Because we can't do it with the sales tax.
Funding infrastructure projects is really easy because the city owns that infrastructure.
But the power lines become a real complication in that.
You would just have to figure out how to structure it so that it would be RDA. It would either be an RDA bond, meaning RDA tax increment bond instead of a city sales tax bond, or RDA cash paying for that instead of.
Is there an opportunity to guarantee it with? No, we couldn't even we could guarantee it with general fund, but we couldn't guarantee it with sales tax revenue.
Right. The guarantee is the title of the bond. So if it's the city sales tax revenue, ultimately it's the city that's guaranteeing it, even if it's the RDA that's paying it.
And there are cases where bond council cobbles together more than one tool. So
in a single bond.
Yeah. So you don't need to spend a lot of brain damage on those logistics. We need you to be aware that they exist and that they would have to be factored in. But it doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you have to do it in a particular way.
I think another opportunity is we might prioritize some projects in an initial bond this year and do a follow-up bond later on for 400 West or something like that. That's an opportunity as well. We want to put our foot in the water, I guess.
Yeah, I want to go back and say, I don't want to start from a place of saying I want to approve a bond and find out what to do with it. I want to make sure we're clear about what projects prioritize. Go to the board, the bond council, and get ideas of how you go about that, because I think we're going to get the cart before the horse in that way if we're trying to figure out, I just want this money, and then figure out what to do with it. It doesn't really help us be more specific and targeted in what we're doing.
And to be clear, this proposal, this memo, does not necessarily contemplate reducing the amount to the North Temple Catalytic Project. So there is still, all of the other project funds, in a way, would still stand.
Madam
So
Chair.
one of the things that I think would
sorry.
be a follow-up question, I'm sorry, Aaron, just to finish up on this, is there is some money set aside for 400 West. So we might want to look at a reallocation of that for something, if we decide to bond for it. There might be some way to reallocate that current money to some other project there or some other priority.
Or be cash in, right, for the bond.
Could be.
I am in support of this bond discussion wholeheartedly. I think, though, that the projects that we're looking at right here, in my opinion, are a reflection of the $21 million that we set aside and where this board took that money from, and that these are well and good and should happen, but that this list is in response to that shift in funding appropriation, and that there's probably a need for a broader evaluation of priority projects that we may want to consider in the context of these others. And I do want to have a little bit more insight into how our new project areas either are limited by a bond that we do for these existing ones, or what our plan is for considering their infrastructure priority needs.
So that's actually a great, I think a great nexus into one of the other things that was removed from the budget amendment number 3 because of the reduction in revenues was seed funds for the State Street and 9 Line project area. So there are no seed funds now for either project area. Certainly an initial infrastructure project in either area, I'm not sure if it would be infrastructure or something else, would seem reasonable, but obviously if you've tied up program income fund for the next 20 years on other projects, that would limit your ability to use. Typically, program income fund is what you would use in the early years of a project area because it is flexible and can be spent anywhere. So you have just sort of a balancing to do.
And Madam Chair, I also fully agree with that, because I don't want to tie us up for those projects that are coming down. And one of the things that got pulled out here was also the quiet zones. It's not even in the budget anymore at this point. And that's something we've been putting towards for years, not ever being able to get there and deciding, let's make that a priority, get that done. And then we're like, next year is years after each other things for other things. So I'm concerned about, I want to make sure we get to certain projects, get some advice back about how we get those and prioritize them, about how we're going to fund those, and then make some decisions about bonding or not from there.
Will you, just to help clarify for us, just so it's crystal clear and for anybody who's following this conversation, what the funds would be that would be encumbered, specifically how much they are and what they are for, that would be encumbered, that would keep us from being able to do a $20 million bond? Will you state those for us?
Sorry, I had difficulty following the question. So which funds would be encumbered if you were pursuing the bond?
No, what are the funds for and how much are they that would keep us from being able to do a bond?
So maybe another way to say it is the things that were proposed for funding here, are there any that would limit the flexibility in later doing a bond? So there are some things that are just plain eligible for a bond, like the street improvements and the...
So, without being able to go through specifically.
Right. Well, and just let me just pause you for a second. When Mary Beth was here and she said, when we said, so this, if we adopt this budget, it means we can't do a bond. So is there anything that is specific, or is it the whole thing?
You could do a bond. It would just be much smaller.
Okay.
I think, so I'll just kind of walk through.
Okay.
For example, if you spend $5.6 million from Depot District and $1.5 million from Program Income Fund, that's cash that could otherwise be spent on either buying down a bond or other projects. With the same thing, The street improvements on 9th South are proposed to be spent $1.8 million from Program Income Fund and $1.8 million from West Temple Gateway. So I guess I would look at all of the projects that are on that $20 million list. Right now, with the exception of Fourth West, those are all proposed to be funded with cash this year. So to the extent that that cash is spent, then that precludes you from issuing a bond. So it's kind of maybe levers is a better way to think about it. So the more cash you spend, the smaller your bond gets.
Right.
And I think it's exacerbated the more Program Income Fund you spend, because that's the most flexible cash
That
you have.
was my next point. Okay. So, okay. Erin.
Jennifer, will you remind us with the sort of updated definition of increased capacity use for impact fees on roadways, on streets, whether or not we could use any impact fee monies as a revenue stream for a bond?
Impact fees can be used on debt service, but it has to be an impact fee eligible project. And we did a double check. It was like one of the first things we did, I think, that none of these are eligible for impact fees.
So the one I wanted
because they're not growth related.
The one I wanted to follow up on and confirm is the component of 9th South that I think we're considering as a piece of the 9-line east-west corridor trail. And so I'm wondering if it's the way we've defined it or if there's an opportunity there. Because as we look at that as a piece of that comprehensive connection east to west as a trail, I'm wondering if that doesn't fall under a parks definition.
We could do a double check. It would take some time. So
it feels like that at least would be worth exploring, because that's my hope that it's a piece of that trail component from a to connect to the Jordan River.
That said, there was a significant reduction in the parks that were allowable for impact fees, meaning the total amount to spend on parks was much, much, much lower than the previous version of the impact fee plan. So we would just have to double check with the attorney's office.
Yeah, and the way they did it, though, it did give more flexibility. So
on how you spend it, but
not
less amount.
How much money?
Yeah. So it's.
So we couldn't possibly answer that today.
All right, I think, let me summarize. I think we are interested in understanding our options for bonds. We've discussed it. We want that. I think Cindy's point was well taken, that it's tough for us to do this on our own. We want to have conversations with the administration, see if there are ways that we can make this work and maybe not be expending our most flexible cash this year. Am I hearing that right? Don't necessarily. Go ahead, Andrew.
I just think we need to know exactly our options before we allocate that in. So.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yeah.
I kind of agree with Andrew on this, but in looking at the administration recommends exploration and discussion with board about bonding for other priority projects. They've included 100 South utility undergrounding, 400 West street reconstruction, and the 3 remaining quiet zones. The only one that wouldn't be on here is the 9th South streetscapes and undergrounding, which they're almost all the same. I mean, if you lump them together, if you look at that. So if we were going to bond, and looking at that, I'd like to see more data on that, but I would approve all of them being bonded for.
Can we just double check here with Jennifer? Was there anything else missing? Is 9th South the only thing that's not included on the potential bonding list?
I think maybe the staff report might be that we're not characterizing it the right way. I think it's that the administration wanted to engage in a conversation about future projects that could be funded with a bond, not that we would be able to bond for those projects that were listed in that. Because I think once you let that cash out the door, I don't know what bond you could do. And so if that would be enough to pay for the utility undergrounding and the
all the other projects.
Right.
So basically, it's just discussing item by item, not as a lump.
Right, and even item by item, there might not be sufficient, yeah.
I would like to invite David and Laura to share any thoughts they might have on this, if you desire. I'm not putting you on the spot, but if there's something you'd like to share in this discussion, please jump in. Okay, anything, Director Fritz? Okay, all right, I just want to make sure to hear from you. Okay, so I think we've had the conversation. I think we move on to the next item. You good with that, Derek?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Aaron?
I guess I as much as I find awkwardness in the transition from the way things were to the way things are, and you know, the developments that are happening across this bridge, really, and that the way that we're going to address these things, I don't think are the way we will in the future, and there's that awkwardness. But I don't want to keep putting off the Central 9th improvements, the streetscape improvements particularly, and I get that there's a little bit more conversation that it sounds like we need to have with maybe Rocky Mountain Power, and maybe otherwise about a bond for the undergrounding, but I don't want to keep putting this off. So I don't want to not move on today.
David, look back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I would comment on that. I appreciate that comment, Board Member Mendenhall. I guess, I'm not well positioned at all to express the administration's position on the bond and some of the concerns that the mayor has about bonding in general, not just in terms of the RDA, but just in general in the environment and whether the environment's the right time to bond in general. But I do think that that we share some of the concern that while as expressed in the administration's recommendation, interested in exploring opportunities to bond on future projects, we are concerned about continually putting off these projects. And the tremendous work that staff has been doing, continues to do, is delayed by continuing to put them off. And part of our desire to not bond is to see these projects come to fruition and move forward. And so I think we're very sensitive to the timing and wanting to see these projects move forward.
Okay, and on that note, we will move to new projects.
9th South.
What do you know? List.
So 3.6 million is proposed in total for 900 South. Of that, 1.8 million is coming from West Temple Gateway, and 1.85 million is coming from Program Income Fund. There's a long-term maintenance issue that we've listed as a policy question, which is that the Public Services Department has indicated they cannot maintain what the proposed improvements are in the along 9th South, and so if the board wants to talk, because obviously the board will have to discuss this as the city council at some point, if the board wants to talk about how those maintenance funds can be planned for, or if there are ways to scale or design the improvements so that they don't have that kind of impact on public services. So I don't know.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Do we have a response from Public Services on what components triggered their responses that they won't maintain it? Is it a design issue? Is it? I mean, I'm struggling to understand.
We've asked the administration that.
I'm struggling to understand what it is they won't maintain, whether it's the sidewalks or whether it's snow plowing or what it is. So.
And I don't think it's a negative in terms they won't. I just don't think they don't have the tools or capacity or resources.
So,
Maybe
so is a special something needed to manage this property, or?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure specific, but we can definitely find out. But I would say in general, and this is not unique to this issue, other projects as well, where we have move projects, capital projects forward and not thought through the ongoing maintenance costs. And public services, as great as they are and always wanting to accommodate, wanting, I'm sure, sometimes to say, no, we can't do that, and it comes out, yeah, we'll figure it out. And I think we're kind of getting to that point where we can't figure it out anymore. We're stretching staff too far. We're not able to maintain, and this is not just the streets, this is parks, we're not able to maintain to the level that we should be and that the residents of Salt Lake City expect. And so I would think that that's probably a significant part of the hesitation here.
So, David, I think it would be helpful for me. I mean, the examples I think of would do, are they just uncomfortable maintaining new planter beds? Are they uncomfortable? I mean, we ran into this problem at 9th and 9th where we didn't have a maintenance plan for upkeep of the benches and paint. And that, is that what the issue is? I mean, it's just not clear to me what that is. And I think we should know what that is up front and anticipate that we're going to have to figure out that maintenance either through an RDA funding mechanism or a general fund mechanism.
And we've clarified since legal opinions that RDAs cannot be used for long-term maintenance.
Yeah.
So that's the other challenge too.
So there you go. But it also may be something that influences our requests for how improvements are designed so that we upfront longer life structures or something. I don't know, but I think there certainly is a conversation around what the costs are going to be associated long term and how much, and you know, whether those are minor or major. But I think you're right, David. We're getting to the point where we're having trouble just maintaining medians, and so what does it look like from their perspective? What are we adding?
And I want to invite Ben Davis to come up again because I think he may know a little bit about this because this is
Sure. Thanks, Madam Chair. So a couple of things. So in coordination with Public Services on this project, they've been involved really since, past 17 months while we've been working on this project. So we've coordinated really closely with them. So the way it's been explained to me is that there's two levels of services. One is basic, and that level of service is, for example, in a residential area. As a homeowner, you're in charge of maintaining everything within the right-of-way, which is typically, a foot behind your sidewalk, across the street, to another foot behind your sidewalk. So that's the right-of-way. So you're in charge of maintaining the strip that actually goes in front of your property as well, even though it is in the right-of-way. So public services in a residential setting, they typically, you get a couple street sweepings a year. Everything else beyond that is classified as enhanced maintenance, and that includes, the trash and litter removal, the ATLV, it's the all-terrain litter vehicle that you see running around the streets. So that cleaning, graffiti removal, power washing, snow removal at the corners and the crosswalks, sidewalk maintenance, and then landscape and irrigation. So what takes this up to that level is all of those things that this project's trying to accomplish. So we've got preliminary estimates from them. They're very preliminary. I'm happy to share those with you if you're interested. It's a big range for this project.
Ben?
Yeah.
Before, in the previous administration, we had started this a la carte work on looking at what the CBD, what happens in the CBD that only happens in the CBD, and breaking out the a la carte sort of price list should another business area like 9th and 9th want to have their sidewalk shoveled or have their flower beds planted or those kind of maintenance things that are already wrapped up in CBD monies and city staff work. And then Tara worked on that with under Rick Graham, and now I know she's gone to the Gallivan Center. Does your list of cost estimates build
Breaks
off
it
of
out.
that work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. That was provided.
That's I've been wondering what happened to that. And that seemed
Yeah.
like a good way to empower the businesses in the area to really look at the nuts and bolts of the individual costs for different services. But we're talking about permanent installation.
Well, it's not just that, it's that we've never succeeded as a city in having a mechanism to receive funds from businesses who might have every intention of wanting to pay for trash pickup and extra snow removal and extra things. That would be either an SAA or a business improvement district, and the last few examples of those have not succeeded. And so ultimately it's public services that absorbs it, because they are great people.
Or the council, and I know
that
council funds it.
Right, that
Yeah,
even
which is the general fund.
The beautiful tree park lands, the median park strip with trees in it, but east of Liberty Park between 9th South and 13th South, that cost a lot of money. At the time, we had partnerships and the community put money in, is a ton of money to maintain. And it's trees. It's not even flowers or shrubs, really. It's just trees. It's so much money to maintain. So I don't fault public services for
Not at
saying
all.
we don't have the capacity. It's got to come from somewhere. But I think at the same time, we have a business community that's up and coming, and they want us to come up with creative ways to make it work where it hasn't worked before. So I guess
And this
let's
is,
find a way to yes.
The information that Ben is mentioning here is not information that we have had access to. So I would suggest saying that you do want to hear it. So it might give us more options that we could suggest to you if we have that information.
And I'll add also, working with Lisa Schaefer and Mary Beth in finance, trying to be creative on how to, a mechanism. So understanding we're putting these projects into play and they need to be maintained. So as you mentioned, ideas to fund this, and this is the policy discussion that has to happen, is, general fund is an option, the SAA, the Property Owners Association. In this particular example, we looked at possibly that there's going to be some public parking on this, maybe, and again, this is, hopefully I'm not speaking out of line, but that there may be an option for parking meters, and I don't know about the timing of that or how that works. It's a fledgling business district, but my point is we're trying to get creative so that we can give public services the tools that they need. I'll just mention that as well.
Mary Beth here, because if she suggested parking revenue for maintenance,
Don't do it.
My point is, we're trying to be creative. We're exploring
count
all
on it.
options because
It's always lower than you think.
I appreciate that.
And there's some other things that we're looking at too.
So a couple of questions that, because I think the idea of an SAA or some sort of property owner fund was floated, and I not necessarily opposed to those tools, but the city's had challenges over the last 2 or 3 times we've tried to implement those as not being successful. And so I think one of the things that is important for us going forward as we talk to people, property owners in particular in these project areas, is there may be a menu of improvements that we can present to them if they're willing to participate in an SAA. And I think that's actually one of the challenges we've had with how to sell an SAA. North Temple is a good example. We created the plan, we did the improvements, and then we came back to them after it was installed and said, oh, by the way, we want an SAA to pay for them. They all said, yeah, not so much. You already put it in. We're done. And so having a timing that allows us to do that as either before or as part of the design, I think could be very beneficial in looking at how the parameters that we design to, and also in how do we encourage property owners to participate, because they know what they will get in the way of enhancements if they participate, and they'll know what they get if they don't. And we've not been successful. We haven't attempted one since Sugar House. We tried at Sugar House and failed too.
Don't forget about Regent Street too.
Yeah.
We did it without they had special equipment on Regent Street to take care and maintain that.
I want to move us along, but can you come back to us with some ideas for funding for maintenance?
And if you could send us the amounts, that would be great.
with
Yeah.
amounts on it, that would be great. And I want to add to our list of policies, and this will show up on the RDA side and the council side, that we probably want to have something where we talk about maintenance, and that as part of the financial package that we get, when something is proposed, that we see dollars of what the maintenance is going to cost and the source for funding that maintenance before we do something. And I want to underscore what Stan just said about, if we're going to have success with SAAs, we need buy-in on the front end, not trying to force it on the back end. I just don't think it's going to move forward. So I think we move with that. And
Madam
also,
Chair.
yeah, can I just finish one thought? And I'd like to ask staff if there are improvements in this area that we could do, that we could scale, that would not be, that the general fund could maintain, instead of having it so that we do stuff, but the general fund could maintain. And I don't know if you know the answer to that today or not. But if not, can you come back to us with that? Okay, go ahead, Derek.
So at risk of repeating my colleagues here, I just wanted to say that, I agree that it's important for us to, it wouldn't be fair for the council or the board to move forward on a project like this, which is essentially, as the mayor put yesterday, an unfunded mandate to public services that they wouldn't be able to maintain in the long run. And I agree with Board Member Penfold about, figuring out what the businesses or the property owners can realistically agree to pay for long term before we figure out what the improvements will be. So with that being said, my question to staff is, I would like to be able to move forward today on something, but it sounds like this isn't doable.
Well, there's another issue. It's doable if you are willing to accept that you will fund the cost without knowing what the cost is. We don't know if this cost is $50,000 or $400,000. We have no idea. We don't have that information. You could approve something conditionally and then ask for the written information about the cost, about the options, and about the fire department. That was another issue that as of yesterday was still pending, whether the currently proposed design is something that the fire department considers to be within code and is willing to stand behind and support. And then I guess pending the undergrounding meeting too. So, you could say, it's our intent to move forward with this. We have these 3 conditions or 4 conditions that need to be satisfied before it moves forward.
And I know that as of 2 hours ago, the fire department had not yet signed off on this. So I guess to David's point, I don't want to delay what staff has done any longer on some of this stuff. I want to keep moving forward, but I guess I'm just expressing hesitation only because it feels like we should be moving forward on some of these projects. But anyway.
Board Member Kitchen, would you be comfortable with having a motion drafted that has those conditions that then we could look at and have very specific hooks that make it trigger when it happens and when it doesn't?
Yeah, and in some ways I think that might allow us to get that information more quickly as well, right? So yeah, I would.
Hope so. Okay.
Madam Chair, and I wouldn't want to lose the opportunity, if there is one, to look at impact fees as well. So if you're comfortable adding that component, because I do recall a conversation about whether or not trails would be eligible. I just can't remember where we landed with that. So I don't want to miss that opportunity if it's there.
And it sounds like there is some information that they could give you right now, or we could wait and get that in writing. If you want this to move quickly, I would suggest you get it now. I know timing is tight, but I don't know how, from our point of view, I don't know how to move ahead knowing nothing about the cost.
Okay, yeah, if we can get...
And knowing nothing about the fire department.
I think if we could get that information that right now, is that doable? Come on up. And what I'm going to propose, and board members, I look to you to see what you think, because we have all these questions, I would propose that we draft a motion that we have a chance to look at over the next week, and then next week during council work session, we reconvene as the RDA to look to adopt at that point, because I was hoping there would not be this many question marks on this, but there are so many that I think, and we're talking about a lot of money, and we're talking about PIF money, that's a big deal, that I think we want to have a chance to think about it. Is there any opposition to that?
Madam Chair, I would just suggest that we're starting to get into a period of pretty full agendas, and I'm totally willing to look at allocating some time next week to do that. I just think we'd have to be careful that it couldn't evolve into a lengthy conversation. I don't think that's our intent anyway. I think our intent is to have something we're all comfortable with, that we could just take the official motion of adopting, but
Right.
that's just a caution I would put out there.
Yeah, I agree with that. Erin, did you?
I wanted to thank you and the RDA staff and Ben and Jennifer and Cindy for working through this with us, and what a long RDA day we've had, and I know we all kind of wanted to be farther along than we ended up being, but we are uncovering policy questions and long-term budget considerations and bonding with the RDA sort of that we haven't really done before. So I do feel like what's emerging is a more functional, even though it probably doesn't feel like that to everyone right now. So thank you for helping us get there, and sincerely, I appreciate it.
And I just wanted to ask, is the expectation that we would have the bonding information for next week as well? I don't know that we would be able to have that before Thursday's packets go out.
Right.
I think it's also important to note, if I can jump in really quick, that we will have another RDA meeting in 2 weeks, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken.
Yeah.
So maybe that
So
could be a more
maybe let's
realistic.
do that. Let's wait until that meeting, so we're not, because you've got a pretty full agenda.
I don't want to discourage you. We can totally accommodate some time to adopt a motion if we're in agreement. We would run into problems if it turned into a longer Q&A session and
Right.
there were modifications.
But if we
if
can't-
we had if we were in a place where we had a motion that we were comfortable with, it's totally doable.
But are we comfortable with having a motion to look at without having the bonding information?
I think what we might want to consider is a couple of options, and maybe we can look at a motion that moves us forward, something that might protect at least some of our bonding capacity going forward, not necessarily having answers, but having sort of a flexibility about how much you want to spend now versus how much we might want to reserve for a bonding option. But if we had a couple of those, I think is that doable?
It is. The one I think concern staff would have is presuming to know where the board would want to take that flexibility from, because ultimately it would be making that policy choice of withholding funds from one project to keep it for bonding. Does that make sense? So the more you can get through tonight, I think the better.
Right.
Maybe
we'll press on, but I thought we could try to wrap up the conversation on that item, on number 1.
So, Madam Chair,
Yeah.
and if I may just extend with Derek's comment, I'm comfortable with moving forward with street improvements with a couple of conditions, and I know the bonding thing sort of hangs over us on that, but not all of it's flexible money. Some of it's allocated there. So, but I do think we need to resolve the police issue. Perhaps some additional information on
Fire?
the
Fire issue?
I'm sorry, fire. I'm sorry, guys. I would never do that intentionally. And maintenance. Just what we're looking at before we make that commitment. But
And then are you looking for a motion for that part of it for tonight?
I'm okay if we do that for next week. I don't want to stress staff out saying do it now and.
Because they could do it.
As long as
I
we
would
can
be
wrap
okay
that.
with doing that. I would be okay with doing that tonight. That seems like one of the more pressing issues. Although I know that the burial gets in the middle of that too for Powerline. So.
And maybe could I suggest that perhaps we have that motion drafted in between RDA and work session, and then maybe we could do it during work session
If
they don't have it ready?
if you want to do it officially today, what I would suggest is we could break for dinner, or we're looking at how to push our schedule back a little bit right now, not adjourn.
Okay.
Then we could come back immediately and take some action and then adjourn and then go into our council work session.
Okay.
Maybe, I don't know if this would be a good time to hear what the maintenance cost would be.
So we have a range, and it depends on, I think they have a bronze, gold, and platinum level. And again, these are very conceptual numbers, between 160,000 annually and 310,000 annually, depending on the structure. So I know it's a big range, right? But those are the numbers that are provided so far for the maintenance.
Okay, then let's power on. Okay? West Temple Gateway Utility undergrounding, there we are. And
that's 2.3 million, and it's all from Program Income Fund.
again, our most flexible funding that can be used anywhere, used in a very expensive way. Okay, any conversation on that?
My question is, why the increase between October and March? Does anybody have an answer to that?
You want me to?
Ben,
I can speak to that.
Yeah,
if-
go ahead, Ben. Stay with us.
Okay, so the primary increase for that is, the way we used to do things versus now, and I mean, it'd be great for us to be able to come with, 95%, 100% numbers. I would love to just give you one set of numbers. That'd make my job a whole lot easier. But really what happened was it was just kind of a function of the project progressing. Really Rocky Mountain Power diving into those numbers a little bit more and understanding better the scope. We walked it twice with them. Each time they got a better feel for what it was, what the scope is, and that's really the reason why.
Is there a good chance that in 4 months from now it could go from 2.3 million to 4.6 million?
I sure hope not. My hope is that it goes down. I think we're in a really good spot. They fully understand the scope of it. They've had their engineers look at it, and those are the numbers that they've provided at this point. So working with, top management at Rocky Mountain Power, they felt very confident with those numbers. So I guess I have to feel confident with them as well. So.
Okay, any further questions on that, or any thoughts on what we want to do with that tonight?
In theory, I don't have a problem with this project. I just worry about a couple of the concerns. Cost, Stan's point earlier about, bearing it for one block today and then needing to do it again in a couple years, for another project. The reality that we have other undergrounding projects in the pipeline that might need to be considered at some point down the road, and we probably won't have the same kind of funds available, at least not cash funds like we do now. I would be interested in looping this into the larger bond conversation.
I would
Madam
just,
Chair, and
yeah, go ahead.
I guess mine's just more of a timing issue. With the street improvements and the undergrounding, is one dependent on the other, or they can be separated out?
They really are dependent upon each other if we're tearing up. So regardless, the power lines need to be moved. At a minimum, they need to be moved from their existing location, whether they're undergrounded or just moved.
How come?
The way that the layout has evolved, largely based on comments from several, all of our stakeholders, public utilities, fire, police, go down the line, transportation, the way that the trail is contemplated in the 9-line master plan, it's supposed to be above grade or grade separated, I should say. That has driven how the design is laid out. And I'm happy to sit down and show plans. We could possibly do that at some point.
So you're saying they're linked based on current plans that are not quite yet approved or finalized?
Say that again.
Did you say master plan? Yeah.
No, the design.
The design.
The design. This design is still being worked. You know, it's not finalized.
Gotcha.
Right. And largely, you know, with Chief Baldwin here, we've worked very closely with fire, and that's been the major driver of how, you know, certain spatial layouts have happened on this project, specifically around 26-foot clear drive aisle that we need to provide for this project for fire access. That, you know, all those factors have weighed into how the design is laid out spatially. So all those constraints combined is how we get to where the design currently is.
Board members, I want to weigh in on this. I don't love how expensive it is. I don't love that it's only 2 blocks. But I feel like the fact that we approved money for this under the previous model, that I think that has sent the signal to this community that we were willing to do it, and they've moved forward expecting that. Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
To clarify, I think the funds were approved previously for the streetscape improvements, not the utility.
Okay, not the utilities,
Right.
but the contemplation.
Approved money for a study.
Yeah, and we approved the money for the study, but I think also the fact that they are pretty closely linked. I'm not very comfortable with using PIF money on it, but I'm wondering if we could have a motion that we look at when we look at the motion for the other part that has some contingencies, because if Rocky Mountain Power came back and said it's going to be double again, we're not going to do that. I can't imagine that. We don't love this price.
Yeah, but I think that in terms of the planning and construction, I think you're at a point where you need to decide if you're committed or not committed.
Okay.
I'm not an expert on undergrounding. I'm learning more than I ever wanted to know, but is that a fair, I mean,
Yes.
is there a point at which later they could turn back?
No.
Like, for example, do they put I know they were diving in the weeds, but, I mean, if you really, we shouldn't have separated this project out, because you
Right.
can't do one without the other.
Right.
And can you find out from the contractors if the vault can be built and then the wires are pulled in later? I mean, because you're looking at, you know, over $1 million in one area and 1.3 in another. And to me, that's crazy that we're just going to funnel this money in just so that we can get the streetscapes in, and then we have to tie the lines in with it. I don't mean to take it out on you, Ben, but this is just really frustrating to me.
So let me ask, we could not move, if we appropriated money tonight, or if we gave you money for the streetscape improvements today and not for the undergrounding, you wouldn't even be able to spend the money on streetscape improvements.
Well, we'd have to move the power lines first. They'd have to be moved. So there would be a cost to move those into a park.
And is that included in the design of the streetscape? Usually it is.
I think there's a chicken and egg thing, because right now with the current improvements that are on the ground, you have to underground in order to do the development. Stop me when I'm wrong.
No.
Okay, but you're already planning to tear those out and put more different street improvements in. Therefore, when you're putting the different street improvements in, you could design a way to move the poles further out. So that is possibly an option.
But that isn't funded in the streetscape proposal, is it?
It's in the undergrounding.
Right, but it's not part of the
Correct.
streetscape.
And they really should be one project, you know, so.
Yeah.
We've looked at it that way.
So going back to Derek's question,
Mm-hmm.
if we didn't fund the undergrounding, another way would just have to be figured out, right? And would that way figuring it out maybe eat up all the money for the streetscape improvements that we want in the poles?
Possibly. Yeah, we'd have to get a cost to move the poles. We haven't got that cost from them.
Okay, well, I'm looking to you, board members, for wisdom and inspiration. What do you think where do we go with this? This is,
I apologize, I had to step out, but can I just get some clarity on where we're at?
Sure.
So it sounds like streetscape is tied to undergrounding.
Mm-hmm.
They should have been one project. That's news. And that we went from, 1.2 to 2.3, and we don't really have a firm cost on undergrounding.
We do. We have a much firmer cost from Rocky Mountain Power. Once we walked the site with them twice since that 1.2 number was established, they understood the project more. They had their engineers look at it harder, provided us with that number, the 2.375.
So what kind of a guarantee do we have about the security of the numbers in front of us right now? Or if not, then be honest with us about how could we accept this now cumulative project with enough flexibility for it to move ahead?
Right. So, like I said, I think the power undergrounding power numbers are pretty solid. We've had several months for them to look at it, coordinate with the engineer on the project, the electrical engineer, to get to that number that we all feel fairly confident.
Fairly and pretty solid aren't good enough.
Pretty
And
solid.
Let me just say
I'll say
that
pretty
when
solid then.
we get into this kind of a conversation and the board goes, okay, all right, we'll say pretty solid is good enough. Let's go ahead. And then developers here, okay, we're going ahead. And then you come back and say, actually, it's going to be $500,000 more, and we're bound at that point. So
I guess what I'm saying is I'm just conveying the information that Rocky Mountain Power has provided me. And so if they feel fairly solid, or what was it?
Pretty good and fairly solid.
Fairly
were your
solid.
words.
They feel fairly solid about it, so I do as well.
When do we get to completely solid?
So we're in 70% design right now, and so
Streetscape or undergrounding?
both.
So why are we being asked to fund it today?
So that we can move forward with finalizing the design, and so that we can get it in the queue to get it bid and then constructed.
So we're being asked to agree to final numbers that are not yet, that are 70%, that are pretty good,
Right.
and accept whatever the 30% left to be done produces.
So we have contingency in our estimates, so
What, 10%?
10%. At this point, that's pretty good. Typically, fairly solid. Sorry, Aaron.
No,
I'll use
both
your
of them
words.
are not
Sorry,
comforting.
I'm sorry.
No, it's the reality of it, Ben. It's not your language that's
Yeah.
the problem.
So, yeah.
You get what I'm
I do,
saying here,
yeah.
though, that we're almost getting at a policy issue. Like, okay, when you get to 70% done on anything, come to us for final funding, and then finish the 30%, and we'll just shrug.
And that's what we were mentioning earlier, is that if that becomes a policy, that helps us. That helps us
They
a lot.
get to 70%.
Get to 100%, and then we can.
And
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
this is maybe another difference we're noticing in the cycle of the RDA versus the cycle of CIP, and how they're a little different. And I think with CIP, there's this rhythm of you ask for funding for the design in 1 year, and then it comes back to the council in the next full year. So you do have to, it's a longer process, and it's probably flawed in that way, but you aren't asked to fund the final project until there's 100% design. Now, sometimes even that 100% is still off by a little bit, but at least you're a little bit more solid.
Right.
More
Right.
solider.
I want to just chime in here for a second,
Sure.
Ben, and thank you for your work on this, because I feel like you are the guy who has one foot on the dock and the other foot on the boat, and the boat's starting to leave because
it's
we're
felt like that
and
at
you're
times.
kind of getting the big stretch, and you're
I'm
thinking,
not very
okay,
flexible either.
Do I
It's like-
stay on land or do I get on the boat? Because this project is caught right in the crosshairs of
It's-
switching from one model to a new model, and I so appreciate all your work on this, and I'm so sorry we're stretching your legs.
It's okay. It's part of the
we're
process.
Not, but it's
fine.
I think we're all learning, and I think going forward we're all going to do this better. But I'm so sorry that you are the guy who's caught there right now.
It's okay.
So and I appreciate it anyway. So what
Is the question, board, are we okay funding with pretty good numbers and fairly certain scenarios? Is
And,
that
well,
what we're up
I'm
against?
thinking that we have a motion come to us that moves us forward, but with some conditions that can be answered pretty quickly.
Right.
Would that work, Ben?
Yes, and where we're at in the design, confident that we can make, with the funds that are appropriated as proposed, we can make that project happen with these numbers.
Okay.
Madam Chair, is there a cutoff point we wouldn't be comfortable then? Is that the inference we're having?
We could make a contingency upon the contingency, right?
Sort of where we're going down is that we're, 70% into this. We're saying we're willing to look at 2.3. Is there a cap at which point that we'd say, no, this is not worth going forward on this much money? Because that would make it much clearer for everybody involved. But
Okay, we got
Help.
heads saying no at
Unfortunately,
the table.
yeah.
Help us out here.
Unfortunately, it wouldn't help. What I just sent and asked Rocky Mountain Power representative, and the answer is, which would you'd expect, is we can't give a firm figure until final design is finished and a contract is signed. So really, this is one of those tough situations that the board, it is what it is. You just need to decide, do you want to find out more information, knowing still that you're not going to have anything definitive, or do you want to just decide?
Madam Chair? So I guess, Ben, my question is, when will you have a final design so we can have firm numbers?
So the design team will need probably another 6 weeks to finalize design. And then we'll get a cost estimate to that final design.
And would you start before that, before design is done on the project?
Construction?
Mm-hmm.
No.
So why wouldn't we wait until the design is done to approve this?
That's up to, that's your prerogative.
Well, I think it's that there's developers whose projects are
How many
basically
developers are we waiting on? I mean, are they waiting on our project? Are they waiting on us?
Developer who's
Just
One.
one developer?
Land Forge. Laura Fritz had a comment.
So really what we're asking for tonight is appropriation of funding. We can't spend that funding until the designs have been approved. So
And who
that's
approves the
hopeful at all.
design?
The board wouldn't
would
approve
have
the
to-
design. No, the board,
No,
in this
no,
separation of
separation of
powers model,
powers,
the
we
board
don't
doesn't
approve the
approve the
design.
design.
That's why it's so darn confusing.
However,
It used to be that way.
however, if those cost estimates came back again, it would require additional allocation.
Or scope reduction. I think that's the concern, that it's happened a couple of times even in the general fund context, where the council approved something and then key elements that were presented to the council as part of projects were removed because of bids going in over budget. So they stayed within budget because they removed elements, and then the council was surprised later on that those elements that they thought were part of it were removed. So again, it's this new model, it's the separation of powers model, which puts all of the pressure on the legislative body to understand everything about the project before approving funds, because that is the only time that the board
That it
/
comes to
council
us.
has the say.
And that's okay. It's just a different system than we've been in.
I don't know if anyone knows if funds were appropriated in previous years and then when we went to the new model, they dropped into the general fund.
They're gone.
They're gone.
Yeah.
Well, and the
There
funds don't
is-
drop, the funds from the RDA, just sorry
Don't-
to
yeah,
clarify
don't
the
drop
record,
into-
don't
into
drop to the
general
general
fund.
fund.
Right, right.
And funds that were appropriated in previous years were rolled into everything that was reallocated by the
Right.
board previously, so
Okay.
they're all.
So I just was looking for that pot of gold out there somewhere. So,
We'll find it when we dig up the ground around there for burial of power lines, is when we'll
perfect.
find that pot of gold.
So,
Madam
Let's-
Chair,
yes,
I'm
go ahead.
comfortable moving ahead with a straw poll that we,
you want to word it?
I guess I need to, huh?
And while you're thinking about that, what my plan is to go to item 4. We'll have a hard stop at 6 o'clock because we're going to hear from a compensation team. And we'll recess as the RDA, reconvene in a work session. Stan, I want to make sure I'm getting this right. Right? And reconvene.
So I think, and correct me, Cindy, if I'm wrong with this, we can recess at 6. We don't want to adjourn.
Right.
We can go to our kind of a time certain with the compensation review presentation at 6 o'clock. We've notified them that we're running a little late. Then I would suggest we do a dinner break from there, reconvene as the RDA with a motion, and then adjourn after that, and we go right to work session. So we've moved everything off except golf, I believe, on the work session.
We've notified.
Who is working on it.
Okay.
So
Staff is
We've
doing
been
an
here.
excellent job of reconfiguring
So-
that agenda. So.
And what my plan is to do when we come back doing RDA work is, if you have any concerns about the remainder of the items, let's go to those and let's see if we can move forward and get some things adopted maybe tonight. Be good if we can do that. There's a comfort level. So, Aaron, tell me when you're ready, and we'll straw poll it.
I know. Are we really want to do this like this?
What, sorry?
Do we really want to do this like this?
Well,
I'm
tell
looking
me
at
what you want to do then.
$5.9 million,
Mhm.
which is $2.3 million for the West Temple Gateway utility undergrounding from 9th South West Temple to 300 West, using program income fund, in addition to $3,660,998 for the 9th South Street improvements, of which we have already approved $151,400. Am I right on that one? Is that number minus that?
So are you,
And-
let me interrupt you for a minute. Are you wanting to straw poll the motion right now?
Well, are you putting together the motion?
Yeah, it would really help us
Okay.
to know what we should include in the motion sheet.
Okay.
That way we don't
I
have to
I
have a
thought
long
maybe we
discussion
would
after.
talk about that during the break.
Oh, okay.
Well, then we could end up getting different requests from different council members.
Okay, all right, go forward then. This
Well,
is
it's
just
all or
messy.
nothing here,
Yeah.
right? So, put your mic on, man.
It's all or nothing here, but we can also amend the straw poll and have a conversation publicly as a body. So
Just
why
make a
don't-
straw poll and we
why
can
don't you make
do
your
friendly
pitch and we can
amendments.
see how everybody feels about it?
But you
and-
don't need a straw poll, you just need to know the elements to include.
Elements, we'll
So
work on
that's
language with
what-
the attorney's office and the RDA staff.
Okay. So the funding source for the 9th South Street improvements is 1.813 million in change for the West Temple Gate, from the West Temple Gateway Fund, and 1.847960 from the Program Income Fund, which together is the $3,660,998 for the 9th South Street improvements.
I have the 3.811.
I'm looking at page 6.
I'm on page 3. Okay.
Go down to 6, because that's under the new programs and projects.
Yep.
And then I want included in there something about, and David or Laura, maybe you want to help us about creating the ongoing maintenance opportunity list for the businesses in the area or something. Does somebody have better language on that? You know what I'm talking about.
It would, right now, functionally, the only legal way for businesses to pay for that kind of thing is an SAA, unless there's a mechanism I don't know about. And I think the more specific you could be, the better, because I think then that's the cue for city administrative departments that would have to pick up that ball and carry it to make sure that it happened.
Then let's be specific about that the RDA board intends to initiate the funding discussions for ongoing maintenance through an SAA mechanism.
And you might want to let Laura answer that last question. And I don't know, because it might inform where we go next with that SAA, I don't know. I thought you had a magic idea.
So, what we could do is we could talk to the property owners about the concept of an SAA. I can't say that they're going to vote for an SAA,
Right?
but we could absolutely talk to the property owners in the area that would be affected and see if they'd be willing to, based on cost estimates and the drawing, the beautiful drawings Ben's putting together on what the streetscape will look like, see if they'd be willing to support an SAA, but I can't guarantee that they will support it.
Then I might propose in this motion that our funding is conditional upon something more solid for ongoing maintenance, and even if it's a portion of the maintenance, but that we get somewhere. My sense of this board is that we aren't, just my sense, that we aren't also signing up for 200,000 plus of annual ongoing maintenance for these streetscape improvements. If that's what we're getting on the hook for, then I'm not going to make a motion. So I get that we can't say guaranteed the businesses are going to sign on, but how do we set ourselves up so we have some assurity that we aren't going to be 100% on the hook for that maintenance?
David Litvak and then Laura.
So if I'm tracking all the conversation, no guarantee. Ben mentioned there's some different ideas that are being explored for the maintenance and how to cover it. And so Board Member Mendenhall, maybe a suggestion would be in the motion to condition the appropriation on staff coming back, reporting back to the RDA board on recommendations for how that maintenance will be covered, which could include exploring the SAA and having those conversations with the property owners, as well as other opportunities or options that may come up. And so that staff would be bringing that information and a recommendation back to the board. But we wouldn't be limiting that to one specific idea yet. Is that accurate, Ben?
Yes.
Is that?
I think that would.
I think the challenge, actually, unintentionally, I think the challenge that creates is a timing one for the release of funds for the project itself. Because I think if it needs another board meeting to discuss the options, it probably wouldn't be the April 11th board meeting. It would probably be the May board meeting, unless you could whip something together like today. So I don't.
It depends on whether you want to hope for the best or assure that there's as firm a commitment as possible from the abutting property owners. So if you want to assure that you can get as firm a commitment, then there needs to be time for the administration to have that conversation with the property owners. You can make your motion appropriation contingent upon some sort of firm commitment from the property owners, or you can not.
What would a firm commitment be? How would
The attorney's office would have to answer that. You obviously can't go through a special assessment area process that quickly. There have been some cases where the RDA has put into contracts that, and the developers have voluntarily agreed not to protest an SAA. That hasn't always worked. I don't know if the city is the owner of property at this time. You can put some requirements on the sale of the property. If the city owns the property, I don't know enough about it. Could we have the attorney's office come up? The other is, if you're willing to just take the risk and know that the fallback is the general fund, that's what, that's the other choice.
And then I think that begs the question, is it worth us to move forward, even if the general fund is the backstop? Maybe not, but maybe it is. I don't know. I mean, this plays into our neighborhood node economic development initiative. So
I don't think that I think this is one of the first times we've had a really honest conversation up front about the actual ongoing maintenance costs for these types of investments. That typically we don't think about it, and Parks and Services says, we'll figure it out. And then, it shows up a year later in the budget, or it actually isn't even that articulated. So
it's service level decreases.
Yeah, the last three times you have had the discussion up front, and you have accepted that there was a way to address it, and that way has failed. So, but yes, there have been a lot of times when you haven't.
We
had
need
the
a parks administration that has taxing authority. And I'm serious about that.
I could just add, if it's okay, for the general fund, the argument possibly for it could be, these RDA areas are created to spur development that increases property taxes, sales taxes. I mean, I just put that out there for consideration. Maybe that helps, maybe it doesn't in your minds. I just,
We don't get it until once
Okay.
the project area is closed, which in this case is a year.
is soon.
Yeah,
You're exactly right.
exactly.
So
It works.
Yes, exactly. So just put that out there.
Okay, Aaron, then do you want to put a straw poll out there, or what do you think?
Well, we're just asking you for components of a motion, right? We're not straw
Right, so
polling
we're not
right
going to
now.
straw poll it, okay.
Do
Do
you-
any board members, do you want to add anything else to?
I
give
would.
back?
I
Okay,
would,
James,
I would
thanks.
want to put in there some sort of overage that incidentals are not to exceed 5% of the total project of this money. If we're gonna even look at it, I mean, this is, for me, the project's not going to happen unless we do it. I mean, think about that. It's crazy to think about that we're discussing whether or not we're going to fund this great area, and I'm leaning towards not doing it. Just because of the way it's been handled, not because of the staff, but just this whole process. And I think that we should have this discussion in new project areas. If we're going to make huge investments in a main corridor like we're doing here, we need to discuss SAAs for these areas in order to compensate or maintain these areas that we're doing up front from the beginning.
So James, normally 10%, so figure
I
we
know,
use for.
I know, but here we are. We're at $3 million more than what it was proposed before. And when we get grief over the airport, when it was within the 10% range, and it was, $270, $300 million, here we are. This is 90% more than what it was estimated. So, and I know that there were rough estimates from the beginning, but for me, that's why I say that you put your pen to the paper and make sure that you budget this correctly.
Okay, anything else? Then we will recess as the RDA, and I'll turn it over to Stan to reconvene, and we'll excuse our panel of experts. And
So, Madam Chair, I think we'll need a few minutes for the recorder to switch over, and so let's take just a quick break, and we'll go into the compensation review committee's recommendations.
okay,
when
you,
we come
are you
back.
telling me you want this chair then? I'll let you have
Yeah,
it.
I suppose I do.
Okay.